She didn't know his name when she handed him his coffee. She didn't know that he owned the building they were standing in, or the three towers visible from the window behind her, or the media company whose logo blinked on the billboard across 54th Street. She didn't know that the man in the charcoal suit, the one who always sat in the corner booth, who always ordered the same thing, who always tipped exactly 20% and never once made eye contact, had been watching her for 6 weeks. She didn't know any of it. What she knew was this. Her feet hurt her mother's hospital bill had gone up again, and the man at table 9 was being a pig. She set Elliot Vance's coffee down without looking at him. She had a situation to handle, and that, according to Elliot himself years later, was the moment everything changed. Not the coffee, not the corner booth, not the 6 weeks of quiet observation. It was the way she walked toward trouble instead of away from it, and didn't even seem to notice she was doing it. That was Jane Calloway. That had always been Jane Calloway. She just didn't know anyone was paying attention. The Tuesday morning shift at Marlowe's started at 6:15, which meant Jane was on the subway by 5:40, standing in a car that smelled like someone's leftover dinner, holding the overhead bar with both hands, and reviewing civil procedure notes on her phone. She had an exam in 11 days. Offer and acceptance consideration. Promissory estoppel. She mouthed the terms quietly, the way she'd been doing since junior year of high school, when she figured out that her memory worked better when her lips moved. The man next to her glanced over. She didn't notice. Marlowe's was a bistro on 54th and Lexington that occupied a strange middle ground between neighborhood spot and power breakfast destination. It had exposed brick and Edison bulbs and a menu that changed seasonally, but it also had corner booths that half the city's finance crowd used as informal offices between 7 and 10 a.m. The owner, a compact Greek-American named Theo Papadakis, had built the place 20 years ago and run it on 2 principles. Good food moved fast, and you treated every table the same, whether they were in a 3-piece suit or a delivery uniform. Jane had been working there for 14 months. She was good at it in the way she was good at most things, efficiently, without drama, and with a precision that people mistook for natural talent when it was actually just preparation. Before every shift, she reviewed the day's specials. She remembered regulars' orders after 2 visits. She could balance 4 plates and hold a conversation and calculate the check in her head at the same time. She needed the money. That was the simple truth of it. Harvard Law didn't come free. And her scholarship covered tuition, but not the rest of it. Not the books, not the rent on the apartment she shared with 2 other students in Somerville, not the Amtrak ticket she bought every 3 weeks to come down to New York and sit with her mother. Carol Calloway had been diagnosed with an autoimmune condition 2 years ago that had no clean name and no fast treatment, and a mounting pile of bills that Jane had taped to her refrigerator because she found that looking away from hard things only made them harder. She got off at 51st Street and walked the 4 blocks to Marlowe's with her bag over one shoulder and her hair still slightly damp. By 6:20, she was in the back, trading her jacket for her apron, tucking a fresh notepad into the front pocket. "Morning," said Deb, who was 53 and had worked the morning shift since before Jane was born. She handed Jane a coffee without being asked. "Theo's in a mood." The produce order came in short. "How short?" "Short enough that we're 86ing the mushroom omelet." The mushroom omelet is every banker's emotional support food. "I know. Hence the mood." Deb leaned against the counter and looked at Jane over the rim of her own mug. "You look tired." "I'm fine." "You always say that." "Because I'm always fine." Deb made a sound that was not quite agreement and turned back to her side work. Jane drank half her coffee, standing up, rolled her shoulders once, and went out to the floor. By 7:30, the place was full. Tables turned every 40 minutes. The noise level climbed steadily as the morning crowd thickened. Jane moved through it the way she always did, focused, unhurried looking, even when she was moving fast, present in each interaction without lingering. She knew the difference between a table that wanted to chat and a table that wanted to be left alone, and she never confused the two. The man in the corner booth arrived at 7:52. She had noticed him the 3rd time he came in, which was the visit at which she'd begun to understand he was a regular. First visit, you paid attention to learn the order. Second visit, you confirmed it. Third visit, you started to see the pattern. His pattern was simple corner booth, always the same one, and if it was occupied, he'd wait at the bar without complaint. Drip coffee black. The seasonal grain bowl if it was on the menu, if not 2 eggs over easy with whole wheat toast, no butter. Water still. He read something on his phone while he ate, but not in the distracted way most people did. He held it at a specific angle and his eyes moved steadily, and he never once scrolled back up, which meant he was actually reading and retaining. He tipped 20%, always exactly 20 calculated to the cent. He never initiated conversation, but if Jane said something to him, just the standard pleasantries of the job, he answered fully without being curt. His voice was low and even. He had the kind of face that was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because whatever was happening behind it was very controlled. She didn't know his name. She thought of him privately as the corner man, which was not particularly inventive, but was accurate. She brought his coffee over at 7:55, set it down while she was still half turned toward the next table, and moved on. She had a situation to handle at table 9. The man at table 9 was named Brendan Holloway. She didn't know that either. She would look it up later after everything. What she knew in the moment was that he was somewhere between 40 and 50, that he was wearing a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and that he had been rude since the moment he sat down. Not in a dramatic way, but in the particular way of a man who had decided as a matter of principle that the people serving him were beneath his notice. It wasn't the worst she'd encountered. There was a category of customers she thought of as the ambient rude, the ones who didn't shout, who didn't make scenes, who just consistently treated service workers as furniture. They were in some ways more exhausting than the dramatic ones because there was nothing to point to, nothing that would justify a direct response, just a steady low-level erosion. Holloway had sent his first order back because the eggs were too soft, which was subjective and fine. He'd sent them back a second time because they were too hard, which was contradictory and less fine. He'd snapped his fingers at Jane twice, which was something she had a particular problem with. She'd been snapped at by a professor once in undergrad and had said very calmly, "I'm not a dog." And the professor had looked at her for a long moment and then lowered his hand and never done it again. She didn't say it to customers. It was a different context. She absorbed it. But then, at 8:12 on a Tuesday morning, Brendan Holloway said something that crossed a line she hadn't known she was going to draw until she was already drawing it. He'd asked for his check. She'd brought it. He'd looked at it and then looked up at her and said with a particular kind of dismissive patience, "Sweetheart, you might want to think about a career with a little more upside. Not everyone's cut out for this." The table nearby went slightly quieter. Jane looked at him. She held the look for one full beat, not aggressive, not flustered. She was 24 years old and she had been managing the gap between what she wanted to say and what she could say for most of her life. And she was very good at it. "Thank you for your feedback," she said. "The total is on the slip. You can leave the payment with me or at the register." "I'm serious," he said, apparently under the impression that she hadn't understood him. "A girl like you could be doing a lot more." There were at least 4 things she could have said. She was aware of all of them. What she said was, "So could a lot of people. Have a good morning." She held his gaze for one more second, not challenging, just steady, and then she turned and walked back to the service station. Her hands were perfectly still. Her face was calm. She was in fact slightly furious, but she had learned a long time ago that fury was a thing you could store somewhere useful until you had a place to put it, and this was not that place. She heard distantly the scrape of a chair. The corner booth man was getting up. She didn't see what happened next directly. She heard it from Deb, who had a clear sightline from the host station. The corner booth man walked to the register, said something to Theo in a voice too low to carry, and handed him a card. Theo looked at the card. His expression did a specific thing. It almost never did. It went carefully blank in the way of a man recalibrating very quickly. Then he nodded, and the corner booth man walked back to his table, sat down, finished his coffee, and left. 10 minutes later, Theo came to find her. "Holloway won't be back," he said. Jane looked up from her side work. "What?" "I had a conversation. He won't be returning." Theo paused. "Don't ask me how. Just, that's done." She stared at him. "Theo, I handled it. I didn't need—" "I know you handled it. I'm not saying you didn't." He looked briefly uncomfortable. "The corner booth left you something." He handed her a folded napkin. She unfolded it. Inside was $500 in cash, 5 crisp hundreds, and a torn piece of the paper menu, written on it in small, precise handwriting. "You didn't flinch. That's rare." Jane stood there with $500 in her hand and read the 7 words 3 times. Then she put the money in her apron pocket, went back to work, and spent the rest of the shift thinking about what exactly she was going to do about it. She didn't spend it. That was the first decision. The money sat in a small zip pocket inside her bag, separate from her tip earnings for 2 days. She was aware that this was somewhat irrational. Money didn't have moral weight simply because of who'd given it or how, and $500 was $500. But there was something about the transaction that she couldn't quite metabolize. He hadn't tipped her for a service she'd rendered him. He'd tipped her for a thing she'd done that had nothing to do with him. It felt like something she hadn't agreed to. On Thursday morning, he came back. Same time, same booth, same order. She brought his coffee and set it down and then straightened and said, "I need to give you something back." He looked up. His eyes were dark gray. She'd never been close enough to notice that before, and he had the expression of a man who was waiting to be surprised. She took the folded hundreds out of her apron pocket and put them on the table. "I appreciate what you did," she said, "with Theo and with whatever happened to that guy. I genuinely do, but I can't take this." He looked at the money and then at her. "Why not?" "Because I didn't earn it. I did my job. You were going to tip me 20% regardless, and that's what I deserved. This is something else." "It's not a tip," he said. "I know, that's the problem." He was quiet for a moment. The morning noise of the restaurant moved around them, the clink of silverware, the hiss of the espresso machine, someone laughing at a table near the window. He had a stillness that she found genuinely unusual. Most people filled silences. He just let them exist. "Fair enough," he said, and he took the money back. She felt something release slightly in her chest. "Thank you. Sit down." She blinked. "I'm working." "I know." "Sit down for 90 seconds. I'll leave a note for Theo." He said it without command, not a request, but not quite an order. The tone of a man who was used to being listened to, but had apparently decided he didn't need to perform the authority. Against her better judgment, and because there was something genuinely compelling about the directness of it, she pulled out the chair across from him and sat. "You're at Harvard," he said. It wasn't a question. "How do you know that it—" "Your bag has a Harvard Law Bookstore receipt stuck to the bottom of the outside pocket. It's been there for 3 weeks. She looked down. It was true. She'd forgotten about it. "I should pay more attention. Most people don't look at things." "You do." "Occupational habit." He picked up his coffee. "How far along?" "Third year." "Well, rising. I'm finishing my second year." "Specialty." "Corporate and securities, maybe." She paused. "Possibly public interest." "I'm still deciding." That's an honest answer. Most people in your program have already committed to an answer, whether or not they believe it. What's the point of an answer you don't believe? He looked at her over the rim of his cup. There was something in the look that was not quite a smile, but was in the same territory. "None whatsoever," he said. She stood up. 90 seconds had probably passed. She had 3 tables she needed to check. "I have to get back to work." "Of course." She was 3 steps away when he said, without raising his voice, "My name is Elliot." She turned. "Jane." He nodded once and looked back at his phone. She went back to work with the particular awareness of someone who has just had an interaction they will be thinking about for longer than seems proportionate. He came back Friday, and the following Tuesday, and Thursday after that. The rhythm didn't change, same time, same booth, same order, but something in the texture of the visit shifted slightly in the way that weather shifts before you can name it. He started looking up when she arrived at the table. She started addressing him by name. Small things. The accumulation of small things. She told herself it was nothing. He was a regular. Regulars became familiar. That was the natural function of repeated contact. She also noticed that she checked the corner booth when she came in each morning, and that there was a specific quality to the Tuesday mornings when she saw him already there. She didn't examine that quality too closely. What she didn't know during those mornings was that Elliot Vance had already learned most of what there was to learn about her. He'd asked his assistant, a 28-year-old named Priya, who had 2 advanced degrees and the organizational capacity of a military operation, to pull together what was available. It wasn't surveillance, nothing that required access or permissions. Just what was public, her academic record, which was exceptional. Her scholarship, the paper she'd co-authored on securities fraud enforcement that had been picked up by a law review in her first year. The address she'd listed on the paper was in Somerville. The address she'd given the restaurant for tax purposes was on East 114th in Manhattan, which Priya noted was associated with a Carol M. Calloway, who had been admitted to Lenox Hill Hospital's immunology department 7 months ago. Elliot read the brief. He set it down. He sat in his office on the 40th floor of Vance Tower and looked out at the city for a while at the specific geometry of it that he'd spent 30 years learning. He was not a sentimental man. He had not been even before Catherine died, and her death had made him less so, or at least had stripped away the habits of sentiment he'd practiced without examining. He was 52 years old, and he had built something large and functional, and he understood it very well, and he understood people very well, and he had not in several years met someone he found genuinely difficult to read. Jane Calloway was not difficult to read. That was the thing. She was entirely legible, her intelligence, her pride, her discipline, the particular quality of her refusal to be diminished. All of it was right there, obvious and undefended. What made her unusual was that she didn't seem to know it was admirable. He called Priya back into the office. Vance Media's legal division, he said. The fall intern cycle. Where does the process stand? We've completed first round screening. Second round starts next week. Final selections end of June. Pull the application from Jane Calloway, Harvard Law, second year. Priya looked at her tablet. There's no application from a Jane Calloway in the pool. I know, Elliot said. Make sure there is one. Priya was very good at her job, which meant she understood what was being said and what was not being said, and which questions it was appropriate to ask. Understood, she said. Anything else? She needs to get there on her own merits. I want the application seated, not the outcome. Put her in the pool with a note that she came through the Harvard Pipeline referral channel. That's a real channel. Her qualifications will do the rest. And if she doesn't make it through, Elliot was already looking at his screen. She'll make it through. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday evening in early May, Jane was sitting at the kitchen table in her Somerville apartment reading through a securities case when her phone buzzed with an email from an address she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. She ignored most things during study hours. But something in the subject line caught her eye. Re-legal intern position, Vance Media fall semester. She set down her highlighter. She had applied, she remembered now, back in February. One of the 30-odd applications she'd sent out to media companies and financial firms through the Harvard Law recruiter portal. She'd honestly forgotten about this one. Vance Media was large, well-regarded, and notoriously competitive. She'd assumed she hadn't made the cut and moved on. The email was from a Priya Sharma office of the CEO. It was brief and professional. They had reviewed her application and her academic record and would like to invite her to a second-round interview. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. She called her mother, a media company. Carol's voice had the particular careful brightness she used when she was managing her energy, which she did without drawing attention to it. Jane noticed every time. Legal division, it's a fall internship. I'd be doing research and document review mostly, but it's a real legal environment. The pay is, she'd looked it up before calling, significantly better than what I'm making now. Jane, that's wonderful. I haven't gotten it yet. You'll get it. Mom? I'm just saying. There was warmth in Carol's voice and also something underneath it that Jane couldn't quite identify. She would think about that later, the quality of her mother's silence when the name Vance Media was in the air. She would think about it and not know what to do with it and file it away. When's the interview? They want me in New York next week. I was coming down anyway to see you. Then it's perfect. It did feel in a certain way like things were clicking into a shape that made sense. She allowed herself that feeling for approximately 45 seconds, which was as long as she usually let good feelings run before she started identifying the ways they could go wrong. Then she went back to her reading. The interview was on a Thursday morning at Vance Tower, which was a 48-story glass and steel building on 6th Avenue that she had walked past approximately 100 times without ever going inside. She wore the blazer she'd bought at a consignment shop in Cambridge because it was her only good blazer, and it was objectively a good blazer. She'd spent 20 minutes the night before reviewing what she knew about Vance Media. The company was a subsidiary of Vance Capital, a private equity and investment firm that also held interests in commercial real estate and infrastructure. Its media arm covered digital news television production and a growing streaming platform. She also spent those 20 minutes not thinking about the fact that the firm was called Vance, that the letter came from the office of the CEO, whose name she now knew from a 30-second Google search to be Elliot Vance, and that she had been having coffee-adjacent conversations with a man named Elliot for the past month. That was probably coincidence. New York was full of Elliots. The interview went well. The two attorneys she met with were sharp and asked specific questions, and she answered them specifically, and at the end one of them said that she would hear by the following Friday. She thanked them, shook hands, and took the elevator back down to the lobby. The lobby of Vance Tower was large and high-ceilinged and had the particular hush of spaces where money moved quietly. There was a long reception desk and beyond it a bank of elevators, and near the main entrance a seating area of low leather chairs. She was putting her notebook into her bag when she heard someone say her name. She turned. He was standing 20 feet away near the elevator bank in a dark suit, a phone in one hand. He looked the same as he always did, contained, attentive, except that here in this building something was different. The other people in the lobby moved slightly differently around him. Not deferentially exactly, just with a spatial awareness of where he was. Jane stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "The coffee shop Elliot." The corner of his mouth moved. "The Harvard Elliot, apparently. This is your building." "It is." She looked at him. "You knew I was applying here." "I knew you'd been invited for an interview." "That's not the same thing as knowing I was applying." He held her gaze without blinking. "No," he agreed. "It's not." There was a pause in which she processed several things quickly. She was 24 years old, and she had been raised by a woman who had always told her that the world was not arranged in her favor, and she should not be surprised when it wasn't, and that advice had served her well. She was not as a default a person who looked for hands extended in help. But she also had the interview notes in her bag, and she knew with reasonable confidence that she had answered the questions well. "Did you help me get the interview?" she asked, directly because that was the only way she knew how to ask anything. He considered this for a moment. "I made sure your application was in the pool." "Why?" "Because your qualifications warranted it, and there's a reasonable chance that without the connection your file would have moved slower than it deserved." She looked at him. He met her eyes without discomfort. "I need to think about that," she said. "That's reasonable. It might be a problem." "I understand. I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I work for what I get. That's not a small thing to me." "I know," he said. "That's why I only made one phone call. The rest was yours." The lobby moved around them, people coming in and out, phone calls, the soft bell of elevator doors. Jane stood in the middle of it and made a decision because she was constitutionally incapable of leaving things unresolved. "If I get this," she said, "it's because I earned it in that room." "Yes. And we need to be clear that that's what happened." "We are clear," he said. She nodded once, put the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "I'll see you Tuesday," she said. And she walked out of the lobby into the bright May morning and did not allow herself to think about the fact that she'd just had the strangest and most interesting conversation of her year, and that both halves of it had been with the same person. Oh. She got the offer the following Wednesday, one day early. She accepted it that afternoon, sitting in the waiting room of her mother's specialist because she'd wanted to have something good to report at the appointment. That evening, Carol held her hand and said, "I'm proud of you. You know that." "I know, Mom." "You've always made your own way." It was such a specific thing to say that Jane looked at her, searching for whatever was behind it. Carol's face was warm and tired, the way it often was now. Nothing readable beyond that. "Are you okay?" Jane asked. "I'm perfectly fine," Carol said. "Tell me more about the company," Jane told her. She watched her mother's face as she described the building, the interview, the practice areas. Carol listened and nodded and asked questions and smiled at the right moments. She did not at any point mention that she recognized the name. The Monday after Jane accepted the offer, Elliot was back in the corner booth by 7:55. She brought his coffee and set it down, and he said without looking up from his phone, "Congratulations." "You knew already. Priya sends me the accepted offers." "Right." She stood at the edge of the table. The morning rush was building. She had 6 covers to manage. "I start in September." "I know, You won't be my manager or anything, direct oversight. Legal reports to the general counsel. I'm 7 floors up." He did look up then. "You won't see me unless you want to." She absorbed that. It was actually the right thing to say, the only version of this that made any structural sense. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he agreed. She turned to go. "Jane!" She stopped. "The application was fair," he said. "Whatever you decide to believe about it, I want you to have the full picture. Your GPA is in the top 4% of your class. Your law review article was cited twice in the past year. The attorneys who interviewed you submitted evaluations that were both of them the highest scores they'd given in 3 cycles. I made 1 phone call to put you in the pool. Everything after that was you." She stood there in the noise and motion of Marlowe's and looked at him for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." He nodded and went back to his reading. She went back to her tables. The rest of the shift passed the same as always, but with a specific quality underneath it that she couldn't quite name. Like a door that had opened an inch and not yet been pushed or shut. She wasn't sure yet which she wanted to do. She worked at Marlowe's through the end of July, 4 more months after the offer came through, because Theo needed the time to find someone, and because she was not the kind of person who left a job half done. In those months, the rhythm with Elliot continued. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, sometimes Friday. The booth, the coffee, the grain bowl, when it was on the menu. But the conversations grew not dramatically, not in ways that felt like crossing a line, but organically the way conversations do between people who are paying close attention to each other without quite admitting it. She told him about her mother. Not all of it. Not the specifics of the bills or the prognosis or the particular feeling she got when Carol's voice went careful and bright, but enough. She told him Carol had raised her alone, that Carol had worked in finance when Jane was small, and then stepped away, that they'd lived in Queens until Jane was 12, and then in a smaller apartment in the same borough, and that her mother was the single most stubborn, clear-headed, loving person she'd ever encountered. Elliot listened the way he read steadily with retention. He didn't fill the pauses with reassurance. He just absorbed what she said and then asked one specific question that showed he had understood it. She found that more comforting than she would have expected. He told her in pieces his wife Catherine, who had died 5 years ago of an aneurysm. Fast, no warning, a Tuesday, like any other Tuesday. A daughter, Sophie, now 22, who was doing postgraduate work in Edinburgh and called twice a week. The company which he had built from an initial fund and 3 employees in 1998, and which he described without particular pride, more as a thing that had grown in a direction he'd mostly managed to keep useful. He talked about work the way she imagined a carpenter talked about a house they'd built, with attention to the structure, the decisions, the materials, not with sentiment about the outcome. "You don't enjoy it?" she asked once. "I enjoy doing it well. That's different from enjoying it." "Is there a difference?" "For most people, yes. Enjoyment is what you feel. Doing something well is what you produce." He considered. "I'm more interested in what I produce." "But Catherine—" She stopped. She hadn't meant to use the name. It had come out before she caught it. "Sorry. Don't be. What were you going to say?" "I was going to say you talk about work like that, but you don't talk about her like that." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said finally. "I don't." He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. And that was also one of the things she noticed about him. He set natural limits that felt honest rather than guarded, and she found she respected them. She gave her notice to Theo in early August. He hugged her, which was not something he typically did, and then handed her a bottle of wine that was, she suspected, significantly more expensive than the kind of thing she bought for herself. Her last shift was a Thursday. Elliot was in the booth. When she came to drop his check at the end of service, he looked up and said, "Last day." "Last day. How does it feel?" She looked around the restaurant, the worn wood of the tables, the morning light coming through the front windows, Deb counting her side work at the station, the hiss and clatter of the kitchen. 14 months of early mornings and aching feet, and the particular satisfaction of managing 6 tables smoothly without anyone noticing the management. "Good," she said. "It feels good. I'm ready." He held out his hand across the table. An old-fashioned gesture, deliberate. She shook it. "September 3rd, he said. "September 3rd. His hand was warm and his grip was firm, and he held it exactly as long as was appropriate, and then he let go and she went to finish her checkout, and she did not look back at the corner booth. The first week at Vance Media was a study in controlled disorientation. She was one of 3 fall interns in the legal division. The other 2 were from NYU and Columbia. Both intelligent, both professionally polished, both surprised to find she suspected that she could hold her own. The division was housed on the 33rd floor of Vance Tower and occupied about half of it, a floor of offices and conference rooms, and a large central workspace where the associates sat. The general counsel was a woman named Harriet Morse, 61, precise with short silver hair, and the diction of someone who had given closing arguments in federal court and remembered that it showed. Harriet ran a structured internship. Research memos, document review attendance at certain meetings. She was direct in her criticism and specific in her praise, and Jane found herself oriented within the first week by the simple fact that she knew exactly where she stood. She worked, hard and carefully, in the way she'd worked at everything. Her first memo, a research summary on FTC guidelines and streaming content, came back with 3 annotations from Harriet. 2 were corrections. One read simply "good framing." Jane pinned that one on the inside of her folder and looked at it occasionally, not sentimentally, just as evidence. She saw Elliot twice in those first 6 weeks, both times in the lobby, both times briefly. He'd said 7 floors up. He wasn't lying. The interaction each time was maybe 45 seconds, a greeting, a word or two, the ordinary exchange of people who knew each other from a context that didn't overlap with the current one. Professional and easy. The second time, as she was waiting for an elevator, she caught Harriet watching her from across the lobby. Harriet's expression was neutral, but her eyes moved once from Jane to Elliot and back, and there was the quality in that movement of something noted. Jane pressed the elevator button again. It didn't come faster. In October, she met Marcus Hale for the first time. He was at a firm dinner, an annual event at a restaurant in the meatpacking district where Vance Capital hosted clients and partners and select staff. Interns were sometimes invited as a development gesture. Jane had been included. Marcus Hale was 45, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of easy confidence that lived just a degree off-center from charm. He'd been Elliot's partner in Vance Capital since nearly the beginning. She'd read his bio in the materials Harriet had distributed before the dinner. His specialty was deal structuring. He had a specific quality that she clocked within the first 2 minutes of being introduced. He was very interested in everyone he spoke to, and the interest felt genuine, and something about that made her trust it less rather than more. He shook her hand and held it a half-second longer than necessary. "Jane Calloway," he said, reading from no visible source. "Harvard Law. 3rd year now." "That's right. Great institution. I had a case involving some of your faculty, actually, a few years back. Fascinating stuff." He released her hand and tilted his head. "Your mother went to school in the city, didn't she? I feel like I recognized the name." It was a strange thing to say. She looked at him. "I don't know. She's from Queens originally. Calloway. Carol Calloway." He said it lightly, the way you float a test balloon. "She goes by Carol, yes. Do you know her?" "Oh, probably not. I know a lot of people. Sometimes the names stack up." He smiled easily and pivoted to the person on his other side, and the conversation moved on. She spent the rest of the dinner with his words sitting somewhere in the back of her awareness, like a notification she hadn't cleared. "I recognized the name. Her mother had worked in finance before Jane was born. That was always how Carol had put it before you, as though Jane's existence were the dividing line. She'd never said which firm. She'd never said much about that period at all, except that she'd left when things became complicated, which was also how she described most difficult decisions in terms that were true and did not invite follow-up. Jane ate her dinner and asked herself why the name Marcus Hale made her mother's particular brand of silence feel present in the room. She didn't have an answer. She filed it. Diana Vance found her in the 3rd-floor coffee station at 8:45 on a Wednesday morning in November, which suggested it wasn't an accident. Diana was 28, dark-haired, with the cultivated ease of someone who had grown up with money and had decided at some point to be competent anyway, rather than simply entitled. She was the daughter of Elliot's late brother, which made her his niece and his protégé in roughly equal measure. She ran the real estate division's acquisitions arm with what Jane had heard described as an iron memory and a very patient mouth. "Jane Calloway," Diana said. "I've heard about you." "From who?" "From Harriet. She doesn't compliment interns." Diana poured herself coffee and leaned against the counter in a way that occupied the space without crowding it. "I also know you've been having breakfast with my uncle." Jane kept her face even. "We know each other from before. I worked at a restaurant he used to go to. Marlowe's." "I know." Diana looked at her coffee, then back at Jane. "Look, I'm not going to be subtle about this because I don't think you're a person who responds well to subtlety when directness is available. Elliot is my family, and I care about him. He's been alone for 5 years, and I think being alone has calcified certain things in him. I watch who he pays attention to. He pays attention to a lot of people. That's part of running what he runs. Not like this." Diana held her gaze. "He went to Marlowe's 3 times a week for 4 years, Jane. I can't tell you the last time he mentioned a waitress. I can't tell you the last time he mentioned anyone new, actually. Not since Catherine." A pause. "I'm not warning you away. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you he's not simple, and this situation isn't simple, and if you're going to be in it, I'd rather you be in it with your eyes open." Jane absorbed this. "Why tell me instead of him?" Diana smiled for the first time. "Because he'd be annoyed that I noticed, and because you seem like someone who can actually use the information." She pushed off from the counter. "Harriet says your securities memo last week was the best work she'd seen from an intern in 3 years, by the way. That's not nothing." She left. Jane stood in the small room with her coffee and the sense of a landscape growing more complex, the way a photograph develops in a dark room, not appearing from nothing but becoming visible detail by detail in the light. She picked up her cup. She had a meeting in 10 minutes. She went. November in New York had a specific quality that Jane had always found clarifying. The tourists thinned out. The light went lower and more honest. The city stopped performing and just ran the subway at rush hour. The food carts with their steam rising in the cold, the particular compressed energy of 8 million people moving through dark mornings and dark evenings with something to do in between. She had always felt more herself in November than in any other month. Something about the season matched the interior register she lived at most naturally serious clear without extra. She rode the train to Vance Tower on Monday mornings with her case materials in a leather folder she'd bought with her first paycheck from Marlowe's, and she sat across from other professionals doing the same things, reading documents, reviewing phones, staring at the middle distance with the expression of people tallying what the day required, and she felt for the first time in years that she was in the right place at the right speed. The work itself was satisfying in the specific way of tasks that require both precision and judgment. Harriet Morse ran a clean operation. The associates were competitive without being cruel, which Jane had not entirely taken for granted. Her two fellow interns, Daniel from NYU, a compact, earnest young man who had already passed his New York bar prep materials to Jane without being asked, and Camille from Columbia, who was effortlessly brilliant and worked at a pace that seemed slightly supernatural, were people she found she liked in the undemonstrative way she liked most things she respected. She was good at the work. She had known she would be, not from arrogance, but from the same honest accounting she applied to everything she had spent 2.5 years being shaped by a school that did not pass people through, and she had made the most of it. She understood securities law with a clarity that came from genuine interest, not from grinding. When Harriet put a document in front of her, she read it the way Elliot read his phone, steadily, with retention without scrolling back. The first time Harriet stopped in the doorway of the small conference room Jane was using for research and said, "That memo you sent on the FCC classification question, I've seen senior associates miss that distinction." Jane looked up and said, "I almost missed it too. I had to read the secondary regulation twice." Harriet looked at her for a moment. "Good," she said, and left. It was Jane would later understand the highest compliment Harriet gave. The question of Elliot existed in a separate compartment, and she was careful about that boundary. She saw him in passing, the lobby occasionally, the elevator, and those interactions were easy in the way of things that have been established clearly. He didn't stop by the legal floor. He didn't arrange lunches. He was exactly as he'd said 7 floors up, and the gap felt intentional on his part in a way she found she appreciated without knowing entirely what to do with. What she did know was that she thought about him with a frequency that had outgrown the casual. She thought about the corner booth and the way he held his coffee and the specific quality of his attention, the sense when he looked at her of being seen by someone who was very good at seeing things and didn't do it carelessly. She thought about what Diana had said. He's been alone for 5 years. He's not simple. This situation isn't simple. She thought about the word situation and how it was both insufficient and entirely accurate. She was 24 years old and she had not in any meaningful sense been in love. She had cared about people, a man in her first year at Harvard who was kind and interesting and whom she had ended things with honestly because she could not afford the distraction at a cost she couldn't define. She had loved her mother with a constancy that was the bedrock of her entire interior life. She was not someone who did not feel things, but she had always prioritized the work. And the work had always been the right thing to prioritize because there was a hospital bill on a refrigerator in Queens and a scholarship that required a certain GPA and a mother who had sacrificed the kind of freedom most women her age had kept for herself, and Jane did not waste those things. So she filed the frequency of her thoughts about Elliot into the same category as the coffee money, something she had not asked for. Something she wasn't certain she had earned, something that required above all her eyes to be open. In December, the dynamic shifted. It started on a Wednesday. She was leaving the building at 6:15 in the evening, later than she'd intended. A research project had run long, and Elliot was in the lobby, finishing a phone call. He saw her and held up one finger, "Wait." She waited. He ended the call, pocketed his phone, and said, "You haven't eaten." "I'll eat on the train." "That's not the same as eating." He tilted his head toward the building exit. "There's a place 3 blocks north, 40 minutes. I have material to review tonight. I know. You can review it after, or on the train. He paused. I'm asking, not arranging. The distinction landed precisely because she recognized it. She looked at him for a moment, the lobby moving around them the way it always did, and then she picked up her bag and said, 40 minutes. The restaurant was small, a corner Italian place that was not fashionable and not trying to be with good bread and a menu that hadn't changed significantly since 1987. He clearly knew the owner. A table materialized with the ease of reserved geography, even though she saw no reservation being mentioned. They ordered quickly. She had the soup and a glass of wine she nursed slowly, and the conversation began in the way their conversations always had, practical, direct, picking up a thread that felt like it had been set down in the middle rather than started. How's Harriet treating you? He asked. Like an intern, which is appropriate. She doesn't treat interns well on principle. She's particular. I know. I prefer it. Jane broke the bread. I'd rather know where I actually stand. Most people prefer the opposite. Most people are wrong. He smiled, a real one, brief and unguarded, the kind she'd learned to watch for, because it was different from his professional pleasantness in a way that was difficult to describe, except to say it used more of his face. Yes, he said. They are. They talked about the work, his and hers, without oversharing on either side. He talked about a deal he was navigating that had gone sideways because of a regulatory change. She talked about a securities question she'd been researching that had 3 plausible answers and no clean authority. He asked questions. She asked questions. Neither of them was performing. At the 40-minute mark, she checked her watch and he said, I know, and signaled for the check. I enjoyed this, she said as they stood on the sidewalk afterward. The December cold was clean and sharp. Her breath made small clouds. So did I. This isn't... She stopped. Restarted. I want to be clear about what this is. I think we're both clear, he said. Are we? He looked at her steadily. I'm not going to push you toward anything. I want you to know that. It's not that I'm worried about being pushed. She found the right words slowly because they mattered. I'm worried about not being able to see things clearly once I'm in the middle of them. And right now I can see things clearly. I'd like to keep that. That's a reasonable thing to want. So what is this? He was quiet for a moment in the specific way she'd come to recognize, not avoiding, just giving the question the weight it deserved. I think, he said finally, that it's 2 people who find each other's company genuinely worthwhile in a city where that's rarer than it should be. She absorbed that. It was honest. It was also, she recognized, deliberately incomplete, not from dishonesty, but from the same careful restraint she was practicing herself. Okay, she said. Okay. She pulled her coat tighter and walked to the subway entrance, and she did not look back, and she was smiling by the time she reached the bottom of the stairs. They had dinner again 3 weeks later, and again after the New Year. The rhythm established itself quietly, not dates exactly, not labeled with anything but evenings that were separate from the professional context that had their own texture and expectation. She told Daniel and Camille that she occasionally had dinners with someone, and they didn't ask follow-up questions, which she appreciated. She told her mother on the phone in January that there was someone she was spending time with, an older man, intelligent, not simple. Carol was quiet for a moment. Older by how much? 23 years. Another pause. Is he kind? Jane thought about it honestly. Yes, in a quiet way. He doesn't perform it. Does he know you? He pays attention. That's not the same thing. I know. Jane sat on the edge of her apartment bed looking at the ceiling. It's early. I'm being careful. You're always careful. Is that bad, Pete? No, Carol said. It's you. A pause that had a particular texture, the kind of pause her mother made when she was deciding whether to say something. Then, what's his name? Elliot. The pause that followed was very brief, less than a second. To anyone else, it would have been nothing. Jane noticed it. Does he work in the city? Carol asked, and her voice had the careful brightness again. He does, yes. What does he do? Finance mainly. Investment. Jane hesitated. His company it's fairly large. He's been building it a long time. I see. Another nothing pause. Just be careful, Jane. Men with large companies have... She stopped. Just be careful. Mom, I'm always careful. I know you are. Carol's voice warmed. Tell me something good about him. Jane thought about it. He doesn't tell me what I want to hear. Oh, Carol said. and the single syllable held something relief or recognition or both. That is good.
Ata.
In February, Marcus Hale showed up in Harriet Morse's office. Jane was in the adjacent conference room. The glass partition was semi-translucent, not opaque. She could see two figures, not faces. She was not listening. She was reviewing documents. But she heard her own name clearly because the conference room acoustics caught specific frequencies. Calloway, intern. She went still, keeping an eye on potential in the pipeline. Harriet's voice lower, not carrying. Then Marcus again, naturally. No concerns on my end, just flagging an interest. She kept her face on her document. She kept her breathing even. She processed what she'd heard with the methodical speed of someone trained to build a case from limited evidence. Just flagging an interest. The same quality as the dinner conversation. The same deliberate warmth over something that did not scan as warm. She didn't know what he wanted, and she was self-aware enough to know that she didn't have enough information to form a conclusion, which was the thing that made her a good legal researcher. She could hold open questions without prematurely closing them. But she noticed, and she did not forget. The confrontation she had been afraid of came in March, and it did not come from where she expected. She was in Elliot's building lobby on a Thursday morning in the second week of March, having arrived early for a meeting. She was reading a brief on her phone and not paying particular attention to the people around her. She heard her name and turned. Diana Vance was coming toward her from the elevator's coat over her arm, moving with the efficiency of someone who had somewhere to be and had arranged this stop anyway. "Do you have 2 minutes?" Diana said. "I have 8 before my meeting." 2 is enough." Diana pulled her gently away from the main foot traffic toward a column. She lowered her voice, not dramatically, just appropriately. "My uncle is about to say something to you. I don't know when soon, I think. I can't tell you what, but I wanted to say this first." Jane waited. "He's a good man," Diana said. "I know I complicated your picture of him the first time we talked. I was being protective, which was right, but incomplete." She looked at Jane directly. "Whatever he tells you about why you're here, about what he did before you started, you should know that his intentions were not small. He is not a man with small intentions." Jane looked at her steadily. "What did he do before I started?" Diana's expression moved through something she controlled quickly. "Ask him," she said. "Let him tell you." She put her coat on. "I just didn't want you to only hear the part that sounds wrong before you hear the part that matters." She was gone before Jane could respond. Jane stood by the column in the lobby of Vance Tower and felt the specific sensation of a floor she had thought was solid, beginning to reveal that it was something more complex, not collapsing, not hollow, but not as straightforward as it had appeared. She went to her meeting. She focused. She answered questions correctly and asked useful ones. And in the back of her mind, precisely compartmentalized and not forgotten, was a single question in the shape of whatever Elliot was about to say. He told her on a Friday evening in early April at the Italian restaurant. It was the 4th or 5th time they'd been back. The corner table had become theirs in the way of things that accumulate without formal claim. She had been over those weeks increasingly aware of how much she looked forward to these evenings. Not in the way of someone falling carelessly, she was constitutionally incapable of falling carelessly, but in the honest way of someone who has stopped pretending that something does not matter when it does. Elliot sat across from her and they talked, and the conversation was always the same blend of serious and easy, and she found in it a quality she had not realized she had been missing, the sensation of being entirely herself with another person and having that be entirely sufficient. She admitted to herself on the subway home after the 3rd dinner falling in love with him. She held that admission for one careful moment, examined it, and then filed it. That was the Friday he told her. They were between courses. The breadbasket empty. The second glass of wine half finished when he set down his fork and looked at her with the particular quality of expression that meant he was about to say something he had prepared. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Okay." "About how you got the internship." The floor shifted in the way she had been waiting for since the lobby conversation with Diana. She kept her face even. "Tell me." "I told you I made one phone call to put you in the applicant pool," he said. "That was true. What I didn't tell you was that I also spoke to the scheduling team about the interview date to ensure you were seen in the 2nd round rather than the 3rd, which would have been after the primary slots were filled." She looked at him. "1 call or 2? 2? You said 1. "I said I made 1 call to put you in the pool. That was accurate and incomplete." "That's a deliberate distinction." "Yes?" He held her gaze. "I knew it was incomplete when I said it, and I should have told you the full picture from the beginning. I didn't, because He paused. Because I wanted it to go well, and I told myself the second call was administrative. That was self-serving, and I knew it. Jane set her own fork down. The restaurant moved around them warm and indifferent. She looked at the table, at the candle, at the breadcrumbs at the edge of the basket, and she ran through the feelings that were available and chose the one that was honest. You decided, she said slowly, that I needed help that I hadn't asked for, and you arranged it, and then you told me a version of it that made it seem smaller than it was. Yes. Why? Because I believed your qualifications were being underseen, and I had the ability to correct that. That's not... She stopped, breathed. Elliot, that's not a reason. That's a justification. The reason is that you wanted me here. He was quiet. Say it, she said. Not unkindly, just say the true thing. I wanted you here, he said, and I told myself I was correcting an inequity, which was also true, but not the primary truth. She sat with that for a long moment. My work, she said. Everything I've done on that floor that is mine. You know that. I know that. It was never in question. Harriet's assessment of me has nothing to do with me. Harriet doesn't give assessments as favors. You know that too. She did know that. It was one of the things she'd been holding on to. I need to think, she said. I know. Not tonight. Of course. She picked up her glass, finished the wine in one sip, and set it down with a precision that was the only evidence of the effort it was taking to stay inside her own skin right now, and not step outside into the safer territory of pure reaction. Thank you for telling me, she said. I should have told you before. Yes. She met his eyes. You should have. She took the subway home alone. She sat in the corner of the car with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it, and she did not cry and she did not think in spirals because neither of those was useful. She thought in a straight line. He had acted without her knowledge or consent on her behalf out of something he wanted. He had told her a partial truth and allowed her to operate on it. He had since told her the full truth without being cornered into it. She hadn't asked. Diana had warned her, but he'd chosen the timing and the disclosure himself. He was 52 years old, and he ran an empire, and he had loved one person deeply enough to still be living in the gravity of her 5 years after her death. And he was also a man who apparently was not above using the machinery available to him to quietly arrange things in the direction he wanted. The question was not whether he had done it. He had. The question was what she was going to do now. She got off at her stop and walked to her building and let herself into her apartment and sat in the dark kitchen for 17 minutes without turning on a light. Then she turned on the light and made herself tea and opened her laptop and went back to work because the work was hers and it had always been hers, and that was not going to change, regardless of anything else. She called him on Sunday morning. I want to be clear about something, she said without preamble. All right. I'm not leaving the internship. The work I do there is mine, and I've earned it, and walking away from it because of this would be punishing myself for something you did. So that's settled. Okay. And I'm not... She held the phone, looked at her kitchen. The hospital bill was still on the refrigerator. Her casebooks were stacked on the counter. I'm not ending this. Whatever this is. I'm not doing that either. A beat of silence. Jane, let me finish. She kept her voice steady. What you did was a unilateral decision about my life that you made without asking me. And I need you to understand, not apologize. Understand what that costs someone who has spent her entire life being the only person in the room making decisions about her life. Because I'm not a project. I'm not a thing you improve. I'm a person who gets to decide what help she accepts and from whom. Yes, he said, quietly, fully. You are. If you ever do something like that again, anything like it, we're done. Not because I'm fragile, because I mean it. I understand. Good, she exhaled. That's all I needed to say. Jane. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard before, not broken, but open in a way it usually wasn't. I'm sorry. Not for the outcome. I'll always believe you deserve to be seen, but for the method, for the omission. I am genuinely sorry for that. She stood in her kitchen and held the apology, and it was a real one. She could tell the difference, and so she accepted it. Okay, she said. Okay, I'll see you Tuesday. You'll see me Tuesday. She hung up, picked up her tea, went back to her casebooks. Outside New York was doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous, and entirely uninterested in anyone's interior landscape, and she found that this morning she was grateful for it. April moved into May. The internship was in its final stretch. She had submitted 4 major research memos. Harriet had commented on 3 of them and passed one to a senior associate without explanation, which Daniel said meant it was being used in an actual case. Jane did not share this with Elliot. She wanted that to exist in its own separate column. She and Elliot had dinner the Tuesday after the Sunday call, and something between them had recalibrated, not repaired, because there had been no full break but adjusted, like a compass finding a slightly different but more accurate north. There was an ease now that had not been there before because the hard thing had been said and survived, and they were both people who found honesty easier to live inside than ambiguity. They walked along this high line after dinner, which was her suggestion, because the evening was warm enough and the city looked good from elevation. They walked without touching and talked about small things, a book she'd read, a deal of his that had closed the particular quality of May light in Manhattan before the summer haze came. At one point she stopped to look out at the river and he stopped beside her and they stood in the comfortable silence of people who no longer need to fill it. "Diana told you something was coming," he said. "Before I said it. She said to let you tell me." "That's very Diana." He was looking at the water. "She's better at people than I am. I built the infrastructure. She reads the weather. You're not bad at people. I'm precise at people. That's different." She considered that. "Is she close to you, Diana?" "She's the closest thing I have to someone who will tell me when I'm wrong." A pause. Catherine would have told me I was wrong before I even finished the thought. She had a speed about that. Something in his voice that was not quite grief and not quite humor, the particular register of someone who has made peace with a loss without finishing the feeling. Catherine would have known within 20 minutes of meeting you that you were not someone to be arranged. Jane looked at him. He was still looking at the river. "Tell me about her," she said. He did. Not everything she didn't expect everything, but enough. Catherine had been an architect. They'd met in their late 20s at a gallery, opening an extremely unlikely meeting for 2 people who were not gallery opening types. She had been funny in a way that surprised people and deeply serious in a way that surprised people equally, and she had never once asked Elliot to be something he wasn't, and he had tried to offer her the same. They'd had 22 years. Sophie had her laugh. "Do you think she'd like me?" Jane asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. It came out without the usual editing. He turned to look at her, directly fully the way he looked at things he was being honest about. "Yes," he said. "She'd have thought you were exactly right." Jane looked back at the river. The evening was warm and the city was lit, and she stood on the High Line beside a man who was exactly as complicated as advertised, and felt underneath all the complexity something that was not confusion and not performance and not ambiguity. It was just true. The way some things were simply true without requiring much more examination. She didn't say it, she didn't need to yet, but she let it exist. The end of May brought 2 things: the formal close of the internship cycle and a call from her mother's specialist that shifted the ground again. The internship close was conducted as a review meeting with Harriet, which Jane had prepared for with the same methodical care she brought to exams. She had documented her contributions, her errors, the questions she'd left open, and how she'd resolved them, and the questions she'd left open because they should not be resolved prematurely. She arrived early, sat across from Harriet in the glass-walled office, and answered every question directly. Harriet reviewed the folder Jane had prepared methodically without rush, and then set it down and said, "I'm going to offer you a return position. Junior associate level starting in January if you pass the New York bar in July. This isn't standard for interns, and I want to be clear that it's based on the work." Jane looked at her. "The New York bar is in July, and I'll be in Massachusetts." "I know where it is. I also know you've been averaging 4 hours of bar prep daily since February, in addition to a full-time intern load. I looked at your access log hours." Harriet allowed a very small expression. "You remind me of someone I used to be. The answer doesn't have to be today." "The answer is yes," Jane said. "It was yes before you finished the offer." Harriet almost smiled. "Good. Don't tell anyone else until you have the offer letter." "Of course." Jane walked out of the meeting, took the elevator down to the lobby, stepped outside into the May heat, and stood on 6th Avenue while the city roared around her, and let herself feel genuinely fully, without the usual compartmentalizing, the straight, clean satisfaction of something she had built landing exactly where she aimed it. She called her mother. "I got a job offer," she said. "A real one, January." Carol's voice was immediate and warm and a little unsteady. "Oh, Jane." "Mom." "I knew you would. I've always known. You have to stop saying that." "I'll stop saying it when it stops being true." A pause, and in the pause, something that sounded like she was composing herself. I'm so proud of you. Every day, but especially today. Jane pressed her back against the building and watched the cabs and the pedestrians and the delivery bikes weaving through each other, and felt the particular specific emotion of being entirely known by one person and entirely proud in front of her. Then Carol said in a different register, "The specialist called this morning," and the other thing landed.
Yeah.
The specialist news was not catastrophic. That was the first and most important fact, and Jane made herself hold it at the front of everything. The condition had progressed to a point where the current treatment protocol was no longer sufficient, and they were recommending a shift to a more aggressive approach. Biologic therapy, a new medication which had strong efficacy data, but also a substantially higher monthly cost. The insurance would cover 60%. The remainder was significant. How significant? Jane asked. She was on the subway home. She had plugged one ear with a finger and was doing math she didn't like in her head. Carol gave her the number. Jane finished the math. The remaining gap between what she currently earned and what this would cost was not enormous, but it was not nothing, and the junior associate salary was still 7 months away. I'll figure it out, Jane said. Jane, Mom, I will figure it out. Don't spend energy on this. It's not your job to figure out. It absolutely is, and we both know that. And I love you, and I am going to figure it out. Tell the specialist to start the paperwork. Carol was quiet, and in the quiet was all the gratitude and guilt of a parent who had needed too much and known it. You are so like your father, Carol said, and then stopped. It was not something she said often. Jane was surprised enough to sit very still for a moment. You never talk about him. I know. Another pause, different in texture from the others older. There are things I've never told you that I should have. When you come home next week, there are things I need to say. About before. About some of the choices I made. Mom, you don't have to. I want to. I need to. Carol's voice was firm under the tiredness. Not on the phone, when you're here. Jane held the phone and looked at the tunnel walls going past. Okay, she said. When I'm there. Next Friday, Carol said. And Jane, congratulations. Today was a very good day. It had been. Even with the ending, it had been. She told Elliot about the job offer that Thursday at the Italian restaurant, and he listened to her with an expression she had learned to read, that particular kind of attention that was not performance but genuine orientation toward her, the way a satellite dish aligns to a signal. When she finished, he raised his water glass. No speech. Just to Harriet's taste. She laughed, a real one, quick and unself-conscious, and raised hers. She doesn't know about us, Jane said after they'd set their glasses down. Harriet, does she? She knows we've met socially. She's not naive. Does it matter to the offer? Harriet Morse has made exactly one professional decision in her 30-year career that wasn't based purely on merit, and it was giving someone a second chance at a deposition that she later described as a sentimental error I have since corrected. She is not going to offer a permanent position for any reason but the work. He paused. The offer is clean, Jane. I know, she said. And she did. But she had needed him to say it, and she was glad he understood that without being asked. She did not tell him about the medical costs. Not yet. That was not his problem to carry. She had a plan. She always had a plan. She would make the next decision when she knew more. What she told him instead on the walk back to the subway in the warm May night was this: my mother said there are things she's never told me about before. She wants to tell me next week. Before when? Before me, I think. Jane walked with her hands in her coat pockets. She worked in finance when she was young. She left when things became complicated. She's never explained what things. She felt rather than saw Elliot slow his pace fractionally beside her. Complicated how? He said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not discomfort exactly, more the specific quality of careful. She glanced at him. He was looking forward. She didn't say. She said she'd tell me in person. A pause. Does that mean something to you? He turned to look at her then. The streetlight made his face clean and distinct. I don't know, he said, which was, she would later think, the most honest thing he could possibly have said at that moment, and also the thing that told her there was something there suspended between them, like a word neither of them had yet spoken. She looked at him for one full moment. Then she said, okay, and turned toward the subway entrance and carried the question home with her like the weight of something that hadn't fallen yet. She went to Queens the following Friday. The apartment was on the second floor of a building on 114th Street that had good bones and a landlord who fixed things within a week when asked. Carol had lived there for 12 years. Jane knew every creak in the hallway floor, the way the kitchen window stuck in July, the specific quality of morning light that came through the bedroom curtain in winter. She had grown up in this neighborhood and left it to study, and always felt coming back both the comfort of deep familiarity and the particular ache of the gap between who she was here and who she was becoming. Her mother was at the kitchen table when she came in, a good sign, because bad days were couch days with 2 cups of tea already made and a stillness about her that was different from her usual stillness. It was the stillness of someone who had decided. Jane sat down. She wrapped her hands around the mug. "How long have you known Elliot Vance's name?" Carol asked. Jane looked at her mother. "Since September," Jane said carefully. "When I started the internship, I already knew him personally from the restaurant." Carol nodded slowly. "And you didn't ask me." "I started to. On the phone in January. You got quiet." "Yes." Carol looked at her tea. "I knew him," she said, "a long time ago, before you were born. I worked at Vance Capital in the early years when it was still small, 30 employees, an office in Midtown that smelled like carpet glue." A pause. "Elliot was building something extraordinary. I believed in it. I believed in him. We were colleagues is not quite right. Friends is closer. He trusted me with the books." Jane kept her face still and her breathing even. "I was his chief internal accountant," Carol said. "I had access to everything. The fund accounts, the investor ledgers, the operating costs. Everything." She turned the cup slowly in her hands. "And I found something." The apartment was quiet. A bus passed on the street below. "Marcus Hale," Carol said. Jane felt something crystallize in her chest, cold and sharp and precise. "He'd been there from almost the beginning," Carol said. "Elliot's partner. Brilliant with deal structures, very charming. He had a quality of always appearing to be on your side, even when—" She stopped. "Even when he wasn't." A breath. "I found discrepancies in the fund accounts. Small at first, the kind of thing that could be attributed to rounding software error and oversight. Then larger. I traced them. It took me 4 months. What Marcus was doing was sophisticated. He was diverting fractions of large investor transactions through a series of shell structures that reported back into the fund on paper but were being siphoned to external accounts. He was rinsing money, Jane. Not his own money from investors who had entrusted it to Vance Capital." Jane was very still. "I documented everything," Carol said. "I made copies. I went to Marcus first. I thought I don't know what I thought. I thought he might have an explanation. I thought there might be something I'd misunderstood." She shook her head once. "He didn't threaten me explicitly. That was the thing. He was very calm. He said that the accounts I was looking at were part of a restructuring he was managing on Elliot's behalf, and that I had accessed materials I wasn't authorized to access, and that if I made any of this public, I would be discredited as someone who had overstepped her role and leaked confidential client information." A pause. "He also said, and this was the part that was explicit, that he had people who could make professional problems for a young woman working in finance in New York, who decided to cause trouble." Jane's hands were still around the mug. "And Elliot?" Carol looked up. "I didn't know whether Elliot knew. That was the impossible part. I couldn't determine from the documents whether Marcus was acting alone or with Elliot's authorization. I wanted to believe Elliot didn't know. I still believe that now looking back. But in that moment, I was 26 years old, and I was alone, and I was frightened, and I didn't know." She held Jane's gaze. "I kept my copies. I put them on a hard drive, and I kept that drive. And I left. I moved back in with my sister in Queens, and I found other work, and I found out I was pregnant, and I made the decision that the safest thing for both of us was to be as far from Marcus Hale's awareness as possible for as long as possible." Jane sat with this for a long moment. "The drive," she said finally. "It's in my closet, in a box labeled Tax Records 1998. I've never moved it. I didn't know what to do with it, and I couldn't do nothing, and I couldn't do something, and so it just—" Carol's voice was steady, but the effort of the steadiness showed. "It just sat." Jane exhaled, long and slow. "Mom, I know. 25 years. I know. Does Elliot know any of this? Not from me. I don't know what he found out on his own. pause. But you're going to tell him. It was not a question. Jane looked at her mother, the tiredness, the relief of the said thing, the weight of something stored too long in too small a space, and felt something in her own chest that was not anger, though it had some of anger's heat, and not grief, though it had some of grief's weight. It was something older and quieter. Yes, Jane said, I'm going to tell him. She reached across the table and covered her mother's hands with her own. You kept us safe, Jane said. That was the right call. What comes next? That's mine. Carol turned her hands over and gripped Jane's fingers, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at the angle Jane had known since childhood, and it was enough. She did not call Elliot from Queens. She thought about it on the subway ride back to Manhattan, turning the hard drive over in her mind the way she turned legal problems, looking for the shape of it, the sequence, the necessary steps. Carol had retrieved the drive from the closet while Jane was still at the table and had held it for a long moment before passing it across like something between evidence and an inheritance, and Jane had put it in the inside pocket of her bag where she kept things she was responsible for. It was a plain black external drive, the kind sold in electronics stores in the late 1990s, slightly heavier than modern equivalents with a white label in Carol's careful handwriting. VC Internal, 1998 to 99/MH. 25 years of storage in a shoebox. 25 years of nothing done and everything remembered. She needed to think before she talked to Elliot. That was the first discipline. She was a third-year law student, and she had spent 2.5 years being trained to think before she spoke. And the training held even now, when what she was holding felt enormous and personal and urgent in the specific way of things that intersect too many important lines at once. She needed to know what was on the drive. She needed to understand whether the evidence was still usable after 25 years, whether the statutes of limitations had run, what legal framework applied, what the exposure looked like for Marcus Hale, and for Vance Capital, and for Elliot, and for Carol. She needed to think like a lawyer before she thought like a daughter or a woman in love. She had Sunday. She would use it. The drive still worked. That was the first thing, and it surprised her, and she spent 20 minutes running data verification before she trusted the results. The files were intact spreadsheet scanned ledger pages, internal memos, a series of transaction trails that her mother had documented with an attention to detail. That was Jane thought the same careful precision she recognized in herself and had always assumed she'd simply invented. She read through everything twice. The second read was slower and more clinical, and by the time she finished the second read, she had 4 pages of handwritten notes and a clear enough picture of what Carol had found. Marcus Hale, between 1997 and 1999, had diverted approximately $4.2 million in investor funds through a constellation of shell entities registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. The structures were sophisticated, layered in a way that made the outbound movements look at a glance like routine operational transfers. Carol had unwound them the hard way, transaction by transaction, entity by entity, until the endpoints were visible. The endpoints were 3 accounts with no legitimate business attached. The statute of limitations question was complex. Federal securities fraud had a 5-year base window and a 10-year extended window under Dodd-Frank reforms that post-dated the original offense. The criminal statutes varied. Wire fraud had a 5-year limit with extensions that might apply depending on when the fraud was considered to have ceased. She was not a criminal attorney, and she would need one to assess this properly. But there was a parallel question that didn't have a limitations problem if any of Marcus Hale's conduct was ongoing, if the structures still existed, if funds had continued to move, the clock had not run. And she had no way of knowing that from these documents alone. She also had no way of knowing from these documents alone whether Elliot had known. She sat with that question for a long time. The documents didn't implicate him. There was no signature, no authorization, no email chain that connected him to the shell structures. Carol had concluded eventually that Elliot was not involved, but Carol had also been 26 and frightened, and she had admitted her judgment was compromised by fear. Jane tried to read the documents as a neutral evaluator, and her conclusion was the same as Carol's. Elliot's name was not in them. But absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. She knew that. She also knew him. Not as an entity in a legal document, as a person she had spent 6 months watching carefully, the way she watched everything carefully, and she had found him to be in all the ways that mattered a straight line. He had told her an uncomfortable truth without being cornered into it. He had held her terms without complaint when she'd set them. He had not in any interaction she'd observed shown the quality of someone managing a concealment. She believed he didn't know. That belief did not change the fact that she needed to ask him. Eat. She texted him Sunday evening, "Can we meet tomorrow?" "Not dinner. Somewhere private. Important." His response came in under 2 minutes. "My office. 8 a.m. I'll clear the hour." She arrived at Vance Tower at 7:55 in the clothes she thought of as her working armor. The Phase 3 blazer dark trousers, a composure she had assembled carefully over her morning coffee, and took the elevator to the 40th floor for the first time. His office occupied the corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides, the city laid out below in its morning grid. It was an uncluttered space, a desk, a long conference table, 2 chairs near the window. Not ostentatious. Functional at a high level the way everything about him was functional at a high level. He was at the desk when she came in. He stood. He read her face immediately. She could tell from the way his expression went to full attention and did not ask how she was or make any of the social gestures that would have felt in that moment like static. "Sit down," he said, and gestured to the chairs by the window, which was the right call. The desk was his territory. The chairs were neutral. She sat. She put her bag on the floor and her folder on her lap. She looked at him. "My mother's name is Calloway," she said. "She worked at Vance Capital in 1997 and 1998. She was your chief internal accountant." Elliot looked at her without blinking. "I know her," he said. Not past tense, present careful as though the name were something still in motion. "I've been trying to locate her for 20 years. The silence that followed was not empty. It had density, the weight of 2 separate stories suddenly sharing the same room. "Tell me," Jane said. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands loose. The posture of a man preparing to be honest about something large. Carol left Vance Capital in the spring of 1999. No notice, which was unlike her. No forwarding address. I tried to find her because I was concerned. She'd been distracted in her last few weeks, quieter. I attributed it at the time to personal matters, and I shouldn't have stopped at that attribution." He stopped. "I should have tried harder to find her." "Why did you stop?" Marcus told me she'd been under pressure, that she'd been dealing with some personal financial difficulties and had decided to make a change. He said she'd left voluntarily and that she'd asked for privacy. Something moved in his expression, not quite anger, but the precursor to it held tightly. I believed him. "Of course you did," Jane said. He held her gaze. "What did she find?" Jane opened her folder. She set the printouts on the table between them. Not the originals, which were still on the drive in her bag, but the summary she'd written the night before. A clear, legal-style narrative with transaction references and entity names. She watched him read it. His face went through nothing visible. He was very controlled. But his hands, which had been loose on his knees, slowly closed into a stillness that was different from calm. He read it twice, set it down, looked out the window at the city. "2 things," he said after a long moment. "The first, I did not know this. I want to be clear, and I want you to believe me, and I understand if you need time to assess that." "I believe you," Jane said. "The documents don't implicate you, and I know who you are. Go on." He looked at her, something in the look that was, she thought, gratitude stripped of all performance. "The second, Marcus Hale is still a partner at Vance Capital." "I know, which means I have spent 24 years in business with the man who destroyed my accountant, kept her in hiding, and may have been running structures that—" He stopped. "I need to see the original documents." "You will, but not today, and not without a plan. I need to know something first." She held his gaze. "The shell structures in these documents, do you know if they still exist?" He was quiet for a long moment. "There are entities in our fund that I've questioned over the years. Marcus always had explanations. Good ones." A pause that had its own weight. "I need to run an internal audit. Quietly. Obviously quietly. And you can't tip him." "I know how to do an audit, Jane." "I know you do. I'm telling you what's at stake if this gets to him before we're ready. My mother." She said it simply, without drama. "He knows she had evidence. If he finds out the drive has resurfaced, he won't." Elliot's voice was flat and certain. "I will handle this carefully." She looked at him for a moment. This man she had watched from across a bistro for months, then across a bistro table, then across the variable and complicated distance of what they were to each other. and she made a decision. "I'm going to build a case file," she said. "Properly. I know I'm not a licensed attorney yet, but I know how to do the work. I'll do the research limitations, analysis, federal securities framework, wire fraud statutes, Dodd-Frank provisions. When I have it structured, you bring in outside counsel, someone Marcus doesn't know." Elliot looked at her steadily. "You understand what you're describing. I'm describing a securities fraud case with 25-year-old evidence that may or may not still be actionable against a man who has had 2 decades to cover his tracks, and who knows how to make people disappear professionally." She paused. "Yes, I understand what I'm describing. You're describing going after my partner. I'm describing going after a man who drove my mother out of her career, out of this city, into 25 years of keeping a secret that has cost her everything it can cost a person. Yes." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That's what I'm describing." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that had a different quality, not executive, not controlled, but human. "Carol has been carrying this alone for 25 years. Yes. And you've been carrying her. Yes." He looked at the printouts on the table, at the window, at her. "Okay," he said. "We do this right." "We do this right," she agreed. She picked up her folder and her bag and stood, and he stood with her, and they faced each other in the corner of the 40th floor, with the city spread out below them in all its indifferent morning business. And the thing that was between them was not just what it had been. Not just 2 people in a corner booth, or on a high-line walkway, or over dinner at a restaurant with good bread. It was something that had been built incrementally from honesty and had just been tested by the most honest thing either of them had said and was still standing. "Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday," he said. She worked through June with the double track running, the surface track finishing her spring semester remotely filing final assignments, preparing for the July bar exam with a discipline that her study group described as genuinely alarming. She had always tested well, and she had no reason to believe this would be different, but she treated it like it might be because that was the only way she knew how to prepare for anything. The interior track, the case file. She built it the way she built research memos methodically, without skipping steps, with a running assumptions log, where she flagged conclusions she'd reached, and the evidence that supported them, and the counterarguments she needed to rule out. She worked on it in the early mornings and late evenings on her kitchen table with the hard drive plugged in, and a separate notebook for legal research that she'd have shredded when she was done. Elliot, meanwhile, had engaged a forensic accounting firm he'd used previously for fund audits, a firm in Philadelphia far enough from New York that Marcus was unlikely to have social connections under the premise of a routine internal review. It was not unusual. He ran audits periodically, and Marcus knew this. The difference was in the scope. He asked the firm to trace every entity associated with the fund's operating structures going back to 1996. He gave them 6 weeks. They spoke by phone every few days. The calls were brief and factual. She reported on the legal framework. He reported on the audit progress. They kept the professional and personal separate in these calls, not from coldness, but from the specific discipline of people who understood that conflation was a liability right now. What she was finding in the legal research was complicated. The base securities fraud claims from 1997 to 99 were likely time-barred under most interpretations. 25 years was far outside any standard window. But the Dodd-Frank provision offered a 10-year window running from the date of discovery, not the date of offense. The question was what constituted discovery. Carol had discovered it in 1999, which started a clock that had also run. But if no one with standing to bring a claim had actually discovered the documented evidence, if Carol's knowledge didn't constitute formal discovery in the legal sense because she'd been coerced out of reporting it, the analysis shifted. The wire fraud question was different and more promising. Federal wire fraud statutes had been extended and had specific provisions around ongoing schemes. If Marcus had continued to use the same or similar structures after 1999, the scheme was ongoing and the limitations analysis reset. That was the variable that changed everything. And it was the variable that the Philadelphia audit would answer. Marcus found out in the 3rd week of June. She didn't know how she would spend a long time afterward thinking about the possible vectors. The audit firm. A conversation Elliot had with outside counsel he'd quietly consulted, a name that surfaced in a document request. She never identified the precise leak. What she knew was that on a Tuesday morning she received an email to her Vance media address. She was still technically a separated intern with 30-day email access from Marcus Hale. It was formal, brief, and framed as a professional inquiry. He understood she had been conducting research into certain historical fund structures and would appreciate a conversation to provide context before any conclusions were drawn, as there was significant background she might not be aware of. She read it once, closed the email, opened it again. He knew she had the documents. He knew she was building something. The email was a warning dressed as an offer. He was telling her, "I know. Come talk to me before this goes further." She forwarded it to Elliot with a single line, "He knows. Clock is running." Elliot's response came in 4 minutes. "Don't respond. Come in tomorrow morning." She didn't respond. She spent the evening reviewing her case file notes, and the following morning she was in Elliot's office at 8, and Diana Vance was already there. Diana's presence surprised her. She looked at Elliot. "She's been suspicious of Marcus for 18 months, Elliot said without preamble. "She flagged transaction patterns in the real estate division that didn't track. I told her to hold and not ask questions. She held." He looked at his niece. "She deserves to be here." Diana looked at Jane, not with the watchfulness of the earlier conversation, something more direct, more equal. "I pulled the real estate division's entity list last week quietly. There are 3 shell structures associated with a Marcus Hale signatory authority that don't correspond to any deal I've worked on or any deal anyone in my division recalls. They've been generating small, regular fee disbursements going back to 2004. Jane felt the architecture of the case sharpen. Ongoing. The structures were ongoing. The clock had not run. "I need to see those entities," she said. Diana put a folder on the table. "I pulled the registration documents. Delaware and Cayman, same structure as what you described from 97. Jane opened the folder. She cross-referenced the entity names against the names in Carol's documents. In her head, she had memorized them. She always memorized the things that mattered and found 2 matches. 2 of the original 1997 shell structures were still active in 2023. The scheme had not stopped. It had been running for 24 years. "This is ongoing wire fraud," she said to no one in particular. "The limitations analysis is clean. We're within the federal window, and the original documents provide predicate evidence for the full scheme going back to 97. Diana looked at her steadily. "Then we have him." "We have a case," Jane corrected. "We have a strong case. That's different until it's adjudicated." She looked at Elliot. "You need outside criminal counsel. Now, not next week. Marcus's email tells me he's going to move." "I have someone in mind," Elliot said. "A woman in D.C. who handled a similar fund case 3 years ago. I've already left a message." "Good." Jane closed the folder. "My mother has the originals. I need to get them out of that apartment." The room went quiet for a moment. If Marcus knows the evidence exists," Diana said, "and he knows Carol had it." "He's had 25 years to act on that and didn't," Jane said. "He decided the safer move was containment. He kept her small and quiet and far from anyone who mattered. But now that the documents have surfaced..." She stopped. "I need to move her." She said it calmly, which was the only way to say it, but underneath the calm was something that was not calm at all. The specific cold fear of someone who has identified a threat to the person they would die for. "I have an apartment," Elliot said. "In the West Village. It's not used. It was Catherine's studio. It's been empty for 5 years." He said it without the emotion she would have expected. This was not the moment for emotion, and he knew it. "It's secure, and it's not connected to anything Marcus would trace." Jane looked at him. "I'll send you the address," he said. "Tell her to take only what she needs." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to." His voice was even and certain. "I failed her once by believing the wrong person. I'm not going to do it again." A pause. "She spent 25 years protecting you. Let me spend 1 week protecting her." Jane looked at him for a long moment. At the window. At the folder in her hands. "Okay," she said. She called her mother from the stairwell of Vance Tower, because the stairwells were the only places in the building without cameras. Carol picked up on the second ring. "I need you to listen carefully," Jane said. "Don't ask questions until I'm done." She kept her voice level. She had practiced this call in the elevator, which she recognized as somewhat absurd and entirely necessary. "Marcus Hale knows the documents have surfaced. I don't think you're in immediate physical danger. He's not that kind of man. He's a paper threat. But I want you out of that apartment and somewhere he doesn't know about. Tonight, if possible. Tomorrow morning at the latest." A silence. "Mom, I heard you." Carol said. Her voice was very quiet. I always knew this was possible. If I ever told you... I know you knew. Can you pack a bag? Jane, I can't just... Mom, I need you to trust me. I have a place. It's safe. I'll explain everything when you're there. A pause. You have been afraid of this for 25 years. You don't have to be afraid anymore, but you need to move tonight. Another silence shorter. All right, Carol said. Tonight. Jane exhaled. Good. I'll text you the address. Take the cab, charge it to the card I gave you. Don't call anyone. Jane. Carol's voice held something that was not fear. It was something steadier. You sound like you know what you're doing. I do, Jane said. And she meant it. She hung up. She stood in the stairwell of Vance Tower between the 39th and 40th floors, with the echo of her own voice fading in the concrete and the case file in her bag, and a plan that was not complete but was moving, and she pressed her back against the wall for exactly 5 seconds. Then she went back upstairs. There was work to do. Carol was in the West Village apartment by 9 that night. Jane got there at 9:30, having stopped at a diner on 8th Avenue to buy soup she carried in a paper bag because she thought her mother had probably not eaten, and because the act of bringing food was something concrete she could do when everything else felt like controlled falling. The studio was on the 3rd floor of a brownstone on Perry Street, one large room, a small kitchen, an east-facing window that looked into a garden below. There were still traces of the woman who had used it, a drafting table folded against one wall, a set of architectural pencils in a ceramic cup, a print of a Hopper painting above the couch. It was a quiet space, not sad. A space where someone had done good work and then been interrupted. Carol was sitting on the couch with her coat still on when Jane came in. She looked tired in the way she'd looked since the diagnosis. The specific exhaustion of a body working too hard to compensate, but her eyes were clear and focused, and when she saw the paper bag, she made a sound that was almost a laugh. You brought soup. You hadn't eaten. I definitely hadn't eaten. Carol took the bag and opened it. Tell me everything. Jane sat in the chair across from her and told her. Everything. The drive contents, the legal analysis, the audit, the shell structure still active in Diana's division, Marcus's email. She told it the way she wrote memos in sequence, with conclusions separated from facts and assumptions flagged. Her mother ate soup and listened with the complete attention of someone who had been waiting 25 years to hear a version of this that moved forward instead of staying still. When Jane finished, Carol was quiet for a long moment. The structures are still running, she said. Yes. He just kept going. For 24 years. The fee disbursements from the real estate division alone total somewhere between 8 and 12 million over the full period based on what Diana pulled. That's a conservative estimate. Carol looked at the soup container in her hands. I thought when I left, I thought he'd stop. That the risk of continuing without me watching the books would be too high. She set the container down. He found another way. He always does, Jane said. That's who he is. I should have... Mom. Jane's voice was firm, not unkind. You were 26 and alone and pregnant. You made the choice that kept us safe. That was the right choice. What comes next is different, and I'm going to handle it. Carol looked at her with that specific quality. Her mother's gaze had always had the quality of someone who saw her entirely and was not diminished by what she saw. You're not alone in this. I know, I have Elliot, I have Diana. And me. Carol held her gaze. I have documentation memory I have never shared with anyone, Jane. Dates, amounts, conversations. Things that weren't on the drive because I kept them in my head where he couldn't reach them. She sat straighter. Whatever your lawyers need, whatever testimony, whatever supplemental information I'm going to give it, I am done being quiet, being... Jane looked at her mother, tired and clear-eyed, and decided in this borrowed studio that still held the pencils of a woman who had built things and felt something shift inside her own chest. Not fear and not grief, but the specific anchored emotion of a story that has been moving in the wrong direction for too long and has finally found its right turn. Okay, Jane said. Then we go. The bar exam was in 4 weeks. She took it anyway. This was not as irrational as it sounded. The case file was substantially complete. The outside counsel, Elliot, had retained a D.C. attorney named Helen Park, who had a federal securities practice, and a reputation for being the kind of person prosecutors returned calls from, had reviewed the materials and confirmed the legal theory was viable. The investigation was in motion. There was nothing Jane could add in the next 4 weeks that couldn't wait for her return, and passing the bar on time was not a small thing. It was the credential that made her a lawyer, the thing that converted all the preparation into standing. She went to Massachusetts. She studied. She sat for the exam on a Tuesday and Wednesday in a conference center in Boston with 400 other people and answered questions about things she knew with the precision of someone who had not stopped preparing for anything even while everything else was happening. She came back to New York and didn't look up her results because they wouldn't be posted for 8 weeks, and there was nothing to be done in the interim. She went back to work.
Oh.
Helen Park was 51 and had the manner of a federal judge, which was to say she spoke less than you expected, retained everything you said, and communicated primarily through very precise questions. She had reviewed the case materials over a weekend and assembled a team of 2 associates, a forensic accountant and a former SEC enforcement attorney she'd worked with on previous cases. The first full team meeting was in Elliot's conference room on the 40th floor. Jane, Elliot, Diana, Helen, and the 2 associates. Carol was present by phone from the West Village studio. Helen laid out the legal theory in 11 minutes with no superfluous words. Wire fraud, securities fraud. Breach of fiduciary duty to fund investors. The ongoing scheme provided fresh grounds. The original 1997 to 99 documentation provided predicate evidence of pattern and intent. Carol's testimony was crucial not just for the facts, but for establishing the coercion, which was relevant both to the limitations analysis and to the obstruction dimensions of the case. The question is venue and approach, Helen said. We could bring this to the SEC, First Civil Enforcement, which is lower threshold and faster, or we refer directly to DOJ for criminal. The evidence supports criminal. The question is whether Mr. Vance is prepared for the public dimensions of a criminal referral. Elliot looked at her steadily. Marcus Hale has been stealing from my investors for 24 years. What public dimensions concern you that outweigh that? None, Helen said. I'm asking to confirm your position. My position is that I want every structure he built taken apart, and every dollar accounted for, and every investor made whole, and Marcus Hale to stand in a federal courtroom and answer for what he did. A pause. And I want Carol Calloway's name cleared publicly. Whatever he did to her reputation in this industry, I want a public record of the truth. From the phone, Carol very quietly said, "Thank you, Elliot." He looked at the phone on the table for a moment. I owe you that. I owe you considerably more than that. Helen Park looked between them. Something in her expression adjusted, not warmth exactly, but the acknowledgement of something that mattered. All right, she said. Then we go to DOJ. It was in the second week of July, as the legal machinery was beginning to turn at a speed that couldn't be stopped, that Marcus Hale made his last attempt. He called Jane directly. She didn't know how he had her personal number. She would later determine that he'd accessed the intern HR file, which still had her contact information, and which he had the administrative authority to pull. She let it go to voicemail. She played the message once in the presence of Helen Park, who was in Jane's apartment at the time going over testimony preparation for Carol. His voice on the message was the same as it had been at the dinner, easy, warm, deliberate. He said he had information about her mother's departure from Vance Capital that he thought she'd want to hear before things went further. He said there were aspects of Carol's conduct in 1998 and 1999 that had not been fully disclosed to anyone, and that might be relevant to how the current situation was understood. He said he looked forward to speaking with her. Helen listened to the message without expression. Then she said, "He's going to try to discredit your mother." "I know. Do you know what he has?" "I don't know what he thinks he has. My mother's conduct in that period was correct. She found fraud. She documented it. She was coerced into silence." Jane looked at the phone in her hand. Whatever he's constructed, it's paper. He's had 25 years to build a counter-narrative, and the only person it ever needed to fool was people who weren't looking. People will look now. "I know. Let them." Jane set the phone on the counter. "Let them look at everything." Helen Park looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone adding a data point. "Good," she said. "Let's go back to the testimony prep." They went back to work. The news broke on a Thursday in late July. It wasn't their leak. They had been careful, meticulous, even about the circle of people who knew the investigation was active. But a DOJ referral involved paperwork, and paperwork involved clerks, and New York's financial press had sources everywhere. The story that ran on Bloomberg at 6 a.m. that Thursday was incomplete and not entirely accurate. It described an internal investigation at Vance Capital and mentioned Marcus Hale's name in connection with alleged financial irregularities. But it was enough. Jane was in her apartment when her phone started generating noise. She silenced it and called Helen Park. "We anticipated this," Helen said. "Earlier than ideal, but the trajectory doesn't change. Tell Elliot he needs to put out a statement." The statement went out at noon. It was precise and formal and had been drafted by Helen's team in advance for exactly this contingency. It acknowledged an investigation was underway into the conduct of Elliot's former partner, confirmed that Vance Capital had engaged outside counsel and was cooperating fully with federal authorities, and stated that the company's investors would be contacted directly with full transparency as the process developed. The financial press ran 3 pieces by end of day. Social media was noisier. The specifics of Carol's role, her documentation, her silencing the 25-year arc of the story were not yet public. That would come later through the legal process in the way that mattered. But the names were out now and the direction was clear, and there was no version of this that ran backward. Diana called her that afternoon. "My phone has been going since 7. "I know. How are you?" "I'm fine. Marcus called me directly. I didn't pick up." Diana paused. "Elliot's handling it the right way." "He always does." "Jane." Diana's voice shifted slightly, something warmer, more personal coming from underneath the professional. "I wanted to say what you've done here. The case file, the legal theory, bringing this to the right people. You were the one who saw the path through it when the rest of us were still absorbing the shape of the problem." Jane sat with that for a moment. "My mother saw it first," she said. "I just picked up what she left." "That's not nothing," Diana said. "That's everything." After she hung up, Jane sat in her apartment in the late afternoon light and let herself be still for a few minutes. The weeks ahead were going to be demanding testimony. Preparation, the formal DOJ process, the public dimensions of a case that was going to generate significant attention. She had a bar result coming in 6 weeks, and a job that started in January, and a mother who was resting in a West Village studio under the careful distance of 5 floors between her and the city that had frightened her for a generation. It was July. The summer light was long and warm. She had been running since September on very little rest and a great deal of forward motion, and she understood in the specific wisdom of her own constitution that the forward motion was not going to stop and did not need to, but that she could, for this one quiet hour in her apartment, let herself feel the weight of everything that had moved and everything that was still moving and be simply a 24-year-old woman sitting with the full complicated reality of her own life. She sat with it for exactly 1 hour. Then she opened her laptop, put on the documentary series she'd been saving for a moment, when she deserved it, and ordered Thai food and ate it on her couch without reading anything, which was as close to rest as she was going to manage right now, and which was, she decided, enough. Across town in the West Village, her mother was sleeping. On the 40th floor of a building on 6th Avenue, a man was looking at the city he'd built, carrying something he'd been wrong about for 24 years, and beginning the process of setting it right. Neither of them needed Jane to do anything more tonight. Tomorrow was sufficient. August came with heat and the particular quality of a city mid-reckoning. The investigation was formally opened by the DOJ's Securities Fraud Unit in the first week of August. Marcus Hale retained counsel, a firm Jane recognized from case law, experienced and expensive, the kind of attorneys who build in 6-minute increments, and had memorized the landscape of federal financial crime the way other people memorized poetry. He was not arrested. That was not how this kind of case moved. He remained at Vance Capital in a technical sense in the way of a man who has not yet been formally removed, though his access to fund accounts had been suspended by Elliot's board action 3 days after Helen Park's referral. He did not leave quietly. His attorneys filed a motion in late August to suppress the original hard drive documents on the grounds that they had been obtained outside proper chain of custody procedures and had been stored in private hands for over 2 decades without independent verification. It was, Helen told Jane on the phone, not an unreasonable argument, weaker than Marcus's team was making it sound, but not frivolous. They would need to establish clear provenance, the chain from Carol's initial documentation to the current case file. This meant Carol's testimony was not supplemental. It was foundational. Everything rested on her account being specific, credible, and unshakable under cross-examination. Jane asked Carol about this directly. "Can you do it?" He's going to have very good lawyers who are going to try to make you look unstable, vindictive, or dishonest. They're going to go through every decision you made in 1998 and 1999 and ask why you didn't go to the authorities, why you waited, why you kept the drive in a shoebox. I know, Carol said. And Carol looked at her across the kitchen table in the West Village studio she had in the 3 weeks she'd been there, made the space her own in small ways. The Hopper print had been rehung at a slightly different angle. There was a plant on the windowsill. She was sleeping better than she had in years, which was the specific irony of a body that relaxes when the thing it has been braced against finally begins to move. I waited because I was afraid for you, she said simply. A woman who is afraid for her child is not a difficult thing to explain to a jury. I'll tell the truth, that's all. Jane looked at her mother. You're going to be extraordinary. Carol allowed herself a small smile. I've been waiting 25 years to say these things to someone who can do something with them. I assure you I've had time to think about how I want to say them.
Mom.
The narrative Marcus was building through his attorneys and through the press, which was paying avid attention, was predictable in its outlines, which didn't make it less damaging for being predictable. He described Carol as a disgruntled former employee who had constructed a narrative of wrongdoing from genuine misunderstandings of complex fund structures she had not been fully authorized to access. He described the investigation as Elliot's attempt to scapegoat a partner to avoid responsibility for fund management decisions that had not gone well. He described Jane as a young woman with no standing to involve herself in a private business matter motivated by personal interest in her relationship with the CEO. The third element was designed to sting. She knew it was designed to sting. She read the press coverage with the same clinical attention she gave to adversarial legal arguments, looking for the structure, the weakness, the point of contact that needed to be addressed. The relationship element was the most operationally useful of the three. It was the only one that contained a complication she genuinely had to think through. She was not Elliot's attorney. She was not retained by Vance Capital. She was not a licensed attorney yet. Her role in the case was as an investigative facilitator. She had built the initial case file, provided legal research, and arranged the consultation with Helen Park. The actual legal representation was entirely in professional hands. None of what she had done was improper. Much of it was simply what a third-year law student with specific knowledge of the facts could and should do. But the relationship was real, and it was visible, and Marcus's attorneys were going to try to use it to paint a picture of a young woman helping a powerful man she was romantically involved with settle a business score. She needed to address it before they could frame it. She talked to Helen about it in the second week of August in Helen's offices in D.C., where Jane had taken the Amtrak specifically for this conversation. His attorneys will depose you, Helen said. That's going to happen. You're a fact witness. You received the hard drive from Carol. You conducted the initial analysis. You brought it to Elliot Vance. Your relationship with him will be raised. I know. What I need from you is a completely honest account of the timeline, not the strategic version, the true version. Helen looked at her over the desk. When did you become involved with Elliot Vance on a personal basis? And was that involvement before or after the disclosure of the documents? Jane gave her the true version. The timeline was in fact favorable. The personal relationship had developed over months before the documents surfaced, which made it clear that Jane had not sought proximity to Elliot in order to use him. She had been involved with him, and then the documents had arrived and she had brought them to him rather than to the relevant authorities first, which was the only point of genuine vulnerability. Why did you bring them to him first? Helen asked. Jane thought about it honestly. Because I didn't know yet whether the documents implicated him, and I needed to make that assessment before I went to authorities. If he had been involved, if the documents had shown his knowledge or participation, the legal calculus would have been completely different. I needed to know who I was dealing with before I decided how to proceed. Helen considered this. That's defensible. It might even be admirable depending on the jury. I'm not trying to be admirable. I'm telling you why I did it. I know, Helen said. That's why it'll play. People who try to be admirable in depositions are unconvincing. You sound like someone who made a practical decision under uncertainty. She made a note. One more thing. Your mother's medical situation. His attorneys may try to argue that your motivation for pursuing this case was financial, that you needed resources and used this case as a vehicle. Jane looked at her. Your mother's treatment costs are significant, Helen said without particular gentleness. That's a known fact. Your financial situation before the junior associate offer was constrained. I need to know this so I can prepare for it. My motivation for pursuing this case, Jane said, was that my mother was silenced for 25 years, and a man who destroyed her career and threatened her and stole millions of dollars from people who trusted him has been operating without consequence for longer than I've been alive. She held Helen's gaze. Yes, my mother's treatment is expensive, and no, that fact changes nothing about what Marcus Hale did when he did it or why it needs to be accounted for. A lawyer who can't articulate why those two things are not the same thing is not a lawyer I want on this case. Helen Park looked at her for a long, even moment. Good, she said. That's exactly how I want you to say it. September. The bar results came back on a Tuesday morning. She found out at 7 a.m. via a website that took 45 seconds to load, during which she stood in her kitchen with her coffee cooling in her hand and practiced breathing. The result appeared in a format that was deliberately plain, a pass/fail notation next to her candidate number, no ceremony, no flourish. Pass. She sat down on the kitchen floor. Not from weakness, it was just the nearest available surface, and her legs had apparently decided they were done being professional about this for 30 seconds. She sat on the linoleum with her back against the cabinet and held her coffee and looked at her phone and let herself feel in the simple, unguarded way of a thing that has been worked toward for years and has arrived. She called her mother first, Carol cried, quietly, briefly, and then composed herself and said in a voice that was entirely steady, "You are a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. Go celebrate, right now. Don't do anything productive today. I have a deposition prep at 2. Go celebrate until 2. She went to a bakery on Bleecker Street and bought a croissant and sat at a small table by the window and watched the September city go past and ate the croissant slowly and did nothing else for 45 minutes, which was as close to following her mother's instruction as she was able to manage. Pass. She texted Elliot, "I passed." His response came in 3 minutes. Of course you did. Dinner tonight. It was not quite a question and not quite a command, and she recognized it as the tone he used when he was certain about something and had decided to lead with the certainty rather than hedge it. 7, she texted back. Your pick. He picked the Italian restaurant. She had expected that and found she was glad. They arrived at the same time, which she suspected was not accidental on his part. He held the door. They sat at the corner table. The evening had the quality of evenings that carry weight, that isn't grief, a significance they had both been building toward quietly through months of careful progress in all directions at once. Counselor, he said when the wine had been poured. She raised her glass. He raised his. They didn't make a speech. They drank. Over dinner, they talked about the case where things stood. What Helen expected from the deposition schedule, the forensic accountant's preliminary numbers on the total diverted funds over the full 24-year period, which were considerably larger than the initial estimate. They talked about it practically because that was how they talked about things. And there was a comfort in the practicality that was its own form of intimacy, the ease of two people who have been through something difficult together and have not broken. Marcus's attorneys have filed a motion to have me removed as a witness on grounds of bias, Jane said. I know, Helen told me. It won't succeed. I'm a fact witness, not an expert witness. The standard for excluding a fact witness is not bias, it's relevance. But it's a nuisance motion, and it cost us 2 days of Helen's time. I know. Elliot set down his fork. I want to ask you something. She waited. When this is over, the case, the depositions, all of it, do you want to stop? She looked at him. Stop what? This. He met her eyes. You've been in the middle of something very large and very complicated that intersects with me personally and professionally. You've been under scrutiny because of me. The press has named you. His attorneys are treating you as a variable to be managed. A pause. When it's done, if you want to simply be a lawyer who works at Vance Media and doesn't have additional complications, I want you to know that's a legitimate choice. I won't resent it. I won't be anything other than glad you're there. She looked at him for a long moment, at the candle on the table, at the bread basket, at the corner booth logic of a man who had been practicing in the corner booth and on the 40th floor, and in the spaces between everything else, the specific discipline of not asking for things he wasn't sure he'd earned. Elliot, she said. Yes. The next time you offer to make yourself smaller on my behalf, I'm going to ask you to review the conversation we had in my kitchen in April. His expression moved that specific brief thing that was more than his professional pleasantness, the one that used more of his face. You remember that conversation very precisely. I remember everything very precisely. You know this. I do know this. The answer to your question, she said, is no. I don't want to stop. He held her gaze. Okay. Okay. She picked up her wine. He picked up his. The restaurant moved around them warm and indifferent, doing what New York restaurants did, holding space for the things people needed to say inside it without commentary. It was enough. October brought the formal depositions. Marcus Hale was deposed on the 7th in a conference room in Helen Park's D.C. offices. Jane was not in the room. She had no role there. This was the criminal proceeding track, and her involvement as a fact witness was separate and later. She learned about the deposition afterward from Helen in the careful way Helen communicated about active proceedings, minimal detail, maximum useful information. Marcus had answered questions. He had answered them smoothly as she would have expected, with the ease of someone who had been managing narratives for 24 years and knew how to present ambiguity as innocence. But the forensic accountant's reconstruction of the shell entity transaction trails was granular, beyond what any narrative could fully address, and the two entity names that matched Carroll's original 1997 documentation were a structural problem that eloquence alone could not resolve. He was charged on October 16th with wire fraud, securities fraud, and one count of obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge was for the documented coercion of Carroll Calloway in 1999, for which Helen's team had assembled a paper record from Marcus's own internal communications that read in conjunction with Carroll's account, and the timeline of her departure made a compelling picture. Jane was at Harriet's office when she received the notification from Helen. She read it on her phone under the desk, with her face arranged in the expression of someone reviewing a case file. She said thank you to Helen via text and put her phone away. She waited until the meeting was over. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button and stood in the hum of the descending car and let herself exhale once fully from somewhere deep. Then the elevator arrived and she stepped in and went back to work. Carroll testified before the grand jury in the first week of November. Jane prepared her for it over 3 evenings in the West Village studio, not coaching her exactly, but going through the questions Helen's team had anticipated, making sure Carroll could give precise answers to precise questions without losing the thread under pressure. Carroll was, as she had predicted, composed and clear. Her memory for specific dates and figures for the account numbers and entity names and transaction sequences she had kept in her head for 25 years was exact in a way that no counter-narrative could easily dismiss. She came back from the grand jury session on a Thursday evening and sat at the table in the studio and said in a voice that was very quiet and not entirely steady, "I said everything." Jane sat across from her. "All of it," Carroll said. "Everything I saw and everything he said and every decision I made and why." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "It's not in my head anymore. It's in a room where it belongs." Jane covered her mother's hands with her own. Neither of them spoke for a while. Outside the window, the garden below the studio had gone dry and late-season brown the way New York gardens went in November. The city hummed at its usual constant pitch. "You should know," Carroll said finally, "that Elliot wrote me a letter." Jane looked at her. "A handwritten letter. He had it delivered here. He said—" Carroll stopped, gathered herself. "He said he should have looked harder in 1999. That he should have known something was wrong and trusted his own judgment about it and not accepted Marcus's version. He said," her voice was not quite steady, "he said he was sorry that his failure to look harder had cost me as much as it did." Jane was quiet. "He didn't have to do that," Carroll said. "He could have put out a statement, had his lawyers be generous, done all the things that look like amends without being them. But a handwritten letter is different. He wrote it himself." "Yes," Jane said. "He would." Carroll looked at her with that look, the complete, unhurried version. "You love him," she said. It was not a question. Jane looked at the table, at their hands, at the window with the brown garden. "Yes," she said. "I do." "Good," Carroll said simply. "He deserves someone who sees him clearly, and so do you." The deposition of Jane Calloway, formal fact witness, was scheduled for the second week of November in the offices of Marcus Hale's defense attorneys on Park Avenue. She prepared for it the way she prepared for exams completely. She spent 4 days reviewing every document she had ever touched in connection with the case, every conversation she could reconstruct, every decision she had made, and the reasoning behind it. She went through her own notes and flagged every point where the defense could apply pressure. She ran mock cross-examinations with Helen's associate, a young attorney named Patrick, who was good at finding the soft spots until she could answer the hard questions without hesitation and without anger. The anger was the thing to manage. She was not an angry person by nature, but she was a person who cared very much about specific things, and one of those things was her mother. And she was going to be in a room with the attorneys of the man who had silenced her mother for 25 years, and she would be required to answer their questions calmly and completely. She could do that. She had been doing the equivalent of that her entire adult life. The conference room on Park Avenue was large and corporate, and entirely impersonal, the kind of room designed to communicate power without spending emotional energy on it. There were 6 people: Jane, Helen, Park. Marcus's lead attorney, a man named Richard Greer, 60-something, very smooth, very expensive, Greer's second, a court reporter and a DOJ observer. Greer began with the basics: her name, her education, her role at Vance Media, her relationship to Carol Calloway, the circumstances under which she received the hard drive. She answered everything simply and precisely. He moved methodically, constructing a foundation before the pressure. When the pressure came, it came in the way she had anticipated. Miss Calloway, at the time you brought these documents to Mr. Vance's attention, you were in a personal relationship with him. Is that correct? Yes. A romantic relationship? Yes. And at the time you received these documents from your mother, Mr. Vance was your, I want to be precise here. He was your employer, in the sense that his company was your employer during your internship. Vance Media's legal division was my employer during an internship that concluded in May. I was not employed by Vance Capital. But Elliot Vance is the CEO of Vance Capital, which is the parent entity of Vance Media. That's correct. And you were simultaneously in a personal relationship with him. And let's be direct. You were benefiting financially from a position that he had facilitated. Helen said, objection to form. Greer moved on as she had known he would. He had made the statement. The question was secondary. She answered the underlying point anyway because she had prepared for this and because she wanted it on the record. I want to respond to what you implied, she said directly but without heat. I received an internship offer from Vance Media that I earned through an interview process with Harriet Morse. Mr. Vance's role was limited to ensuring my application was in the initial pool. The offer was based on my work in that process and my subsequent performance, which is documented and can be reviewed by anyone who wants to. My personal relationship with Elliot Vance did not influence that offer. If you'd like Harriet Morse's assessment of my work, she has been deposed and her testimony is in the record. Greer looked at her for a moment. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his manner, the adjustment of a very good attorney encountering a witness who is not going to give him what he needs from this line. He moved to the next line. When he reached her mother, when he began to suggest that Carol's account was shaped by decades of accumulated grievance, that her memory could not be trusted, that the documents she had kept were the product of a woman who had misunderstood what she was looking at. Jane answered each component with a specific documented rebuttal. The entity names matched. The transaction sequences were reconstructible from third-party records. The current shell structures, the ones Diana had found in the real estate division, bore the fingerprints of the same methodology. The documents don't require my mother's memory to make sense, Jane said. They're internally consistent and they corroborate independently. My mother's testimony adds context and coercion history. The mathematics is its own witness. Greer finished his cross-examination at 3:45. The session had run 4 hours and 12 minutes. Helen said nothing until they were in the elevator. Then she said, "You didn't give him anything." "I gave him everything I had," Jane said. "There wasn't anything useful in it." Helen almost smiled. That's the distinction. December. The case moved into its procedural middle distance, the phase where the large dramatic moments were behind, and the outcome was still months away. And what remained was the grinding, necessary work of building something that would hold in a courtroom. Jane started at Vance Media as a junior associate on January 2nd, exactly as the offer had specified. She sat in the legal division in an office with her name on the door for the first time, and she worked on cases that had nothing to do with Marcus Hale, and she was good at it, and she did not think of the cases as smaller for being unrelated to the drama of the past 6 months. The work was the work. It was what she had trained for. It was what she was. Harriet stopped in her doorway on the second week. "Good to have you properly," she said. "Good to be properly here," Jane said. Harriet nodded and left, and that was the entirety of the welcome, and it was Jane thought exactly the right amount. She saw Elliot. Not in the professional way, though that existed too. He would occasionally send a case question to the legal division that ended up on her desk with a note that read, like any executive communication with nothing personal in it, which she respected. She saw him in the personal way in the evenings, in the rhythms they had built. Dinners that moved between restaurants now, they had expanded beyond the Italian place, which had become the location for important conversations, and so had been given a little space the way you give space to the rooms where significant things have happened. He came to the West Village studio to have dinner with Carol in late January. Jane had not orchestrated this. Carol had extended the invitation directly. She'd gotten his number from Jane without asking, which Jane discovered after the fact, and could not quite bring herself to object to. She arrived to find them already at the table with wine poured and a conversation running that had the ease of people who had been taking each other's measure from a distance for months, and had simply decided to stop. She stood in the doorway for a moment unannounced and looked at them. Her mother and this man at a small table in a studio that belonged to a woman who was gone with the city visible through the window and felt the strange specific piece of a picture that had been partially assembled for a very long time and had recently found several of its missing pieces. Carol looked up and saw her. "You're late," she said. "Sit down." Jane sat down. Elliot poured her wine without being asked because he knew how she took it and had stopped pretending otherwise. "Carol was telling me about Queens in the 80s, he said. "The neighborhood or the borough?" "The borough. She has opinions about the B&Q trains that I think are legally actionable." Carol laughed, a real one, uncautious, the laugh Jane had grown up with and had heard less frequently in recent years. "The Q train has been a moral failure since 1988, and I stand by that." Jane looked at them both, at the wine in her glass, at the plant on the windowsill, at the hopper print at the slightly adjusted angle. She thought, this is what it feels like when the weight lifts. Not all at once, not dramatically, just incrementally in rooms like this one, with people who had chosen each other carefully and were going to keep choosing. She picked up her glass. "Tell me about the 80s, she said. February brought a development that Helen communicated to Jane on a Thursday morning with her characteristic economy of language. Marcus Hale's defense team had filed for a preliminary hearing to determine the admissibility of Carol's testimony, arguing that she was a hostile witness with demonstrated personal bias, and that her 25 years of silence constituted abandonment of any legitimate claim. It was the expected move. Late, which suggested his attorneys had tried other avenues first, and come to this as the remaining option. Helen's response was prepared. "Carol testifies to facts," Helen said on the phone. "Bias is a credibility question for the jury, not an admissibility question for the court. This motion doesn't have strong legs, but I need you to prepare your mother for the possibility that it delays the trial timeline." Jane told Carol over the phone that evening. Carol was quiet for a moment. "How much of a delay?" "A few months, possibly. The motion will be briefed and argued. It's not nothing, but it's not a reversal." "He's still trying to make me invisible," Carol said. Not bitterly. Factually. With the precision of someone who has thought about a person long enough to understand them structurally. "Yes." "Then we answer it." "Yes," Jane said, "we do." She spent the following weekend helping Helen's team prepare the opposition brief, not as counsel, but as a research assistant with specific knowledge of the factual record. She pulled secondary authority on the admissibility standard for delayed disclosure witnesses in fraud cases. She found 3 circuit court decisions that directly addressed the question of coerced silence as an explanation for delay. She organized them into a memorandum that Helen's associate said was the clearest presentation of the issue he'd encountered. It was work she would have done for any case. She did it for this one with the particular quality of labor that has a name underneath it. The preliminary hearing was in March. Carol testified briefly 15 minutes under Helen's direct examination, answering questions about the circumstances of her departure from Vance Capital in 1999. She was specific, composed, and entirely credible. Richard Greer's cross-examination lasted 8 minutes and produced nothing useful for the defense. The court denied the motion to exclude. Carol's testimony would stand. The trial was scheduled for September. Jane did the math. She would have been at Vance Media 8 months by then. She would be 25 years old. She would be a licensed attorney, a practicing associate, and a material witness in a federal trial involving her employer, her mother, and the man she was in love with. Her life was, she thought, unlikely. It had always been unlikely. You grew up in Queens with a single mother and a scholarship and a hospital bill on the refrigerator, and you built what you could build. And apparently, what you could build if you paid attention and didn't flinch and made the decisions that needed making when they needed making was something that looked nothing like what anyone would have predicted for you and exactly like what you'd always been headed toward. She did not share this reflection with anyone, but she thought it walking from the subway to the office on a March morning that had finally decided to be spring, and it felt precise and true, which were the two qualities she had always cared most about in any proposition. March also brought a shift in the city's coverage of the case. A long-form piece ran in the New York Times, well-reported and carefully sourced on the broad arc of the story. Marcus Hale's scheme, the 25-year timeline. Carol Calloway's role, the hard drive, the investigation. The reporter had clearly spoken to people close to the case, not Jane, not Carol, not Helen, but the outline of the facts was accurate and the framing was, Jane thought, honest, a woman who had found wrongdoing and been silenced for it. And a case that finally existed because her daughter had picked up what she'd left. The piece mentioned Jane. It mentioned Elliot. It mentioned their relationship briefly, and in the context of the case, not salaciously. It quoted a legal ethics professor who said that while the personal relationship was unusual, nothing in Jane's conduct had crossed a professional line. Her phone produced a great deal of noise for 24 hours. She answered none of it. She went to work. She came home. She called her mother, who had also seen the piece and had a specific and pungent thing to say about the photograph the Times had chosen to run alongside it. "That's a 20-year-old photo," Carol said. "I looked better than that by 1999. "Mom, I did. You looked fine. You look fine now." "I looked better than fine by 1999. I want the record to reflect that." Jane was laughing before she could prevent it, sitting on her kitchen floor again, which was apparently the surface her body selected when she was feeling something at the full volume. "The record reflects it," she said. "Good." Carol paused. "How are you?" "I'm good. I'm actually good." "I know you are." The smile in Carol's voice was present and complete. "I've known for a while. I'd just like to hear you say it." "I'm good, Mom." "Then that's everything," Carol said. "Go eat something. Don't work tonight." Jane did not entirely comply because she never entirely complied, but she closed the case file earlier than usual. She made dinner. She ate it at the table instead of the counter. She looked at the city through her window, the particular March quality of New York, not warm, but no longer brutal in the specific liminal space between what it had been and what it was going to be. She thought, I am 24 years old, and I am a lawyer, and my mother is safe, and the man I love is honest, and the thing my mother kept for 25 years is in the hands of people who know what to do with it. She thought this is the part where something good is coming. Not easily, not without cost. The trial was still months away and trials were not clean, and she had no illusions about the difficulty of what remained. But the direction was set, the evidence was documented, the case was in motion. She looked at her city and let herself believe it. The trial of United States versus Marcus Hale began on a Tuesday in September in the Southern District of New York in a federal courthouse that Jane had walked past dozens of times without ever imagining she would have standing in its proceedings. It was not her first time inside a federal courthouse. She had done a court observation in her first year of law school and had clerked briefly for a judge in Boston. She knew the smell, the particular combination of institutional cleaning product and old paper, and the specific quiet of spaces where the law worked in its most formal mode. She had always found it clarifying. The theater of it was real. The stakes were real. People came in with lives and left with decisions, and the whole machinery moved around that fact with a solemnity that she did not find excessive. She was not tried. She was not counsel. She was a fact witness with a scheduled appearance in the second week, and until then, she was a junior associate at Vance Media who came to work every morning and did the work that was hers to do and followed the trial through Helen's updates and the news coverage that had settled over the summer into a reliable, if imperfect, picture of the proceedings. The first week was the government's opening and its initial witnesses. The forensic accountants, the FBI financial crimes analysts, the investor representatives whose funds had been affected. Dry and detailed and foundational, the kind of testimony that juries needed to follow the specifics, and that press coverage compressed into single-sentence summaries that lost most of the substance. Helen called her every evening with a brief. Jane listened, took notes, asked questions, and let herself be impressed at the machinery of federal prosecution doing what it was designed to do when it had been given clear evidence and sufficient motivation. On Friday of the first week, Elliot testified. She was not in the room. She had recused herself from all trial attendance until after her own testimony on Helen's advice to avoid any argument about witness contamination. She learned about it afterward again from Helen and from the evening's coverage online. He had been on the stand for 3 hours. He had testified to his own history with Marcus Hale, the 24 years of partnership, the specific decision-making structures of Vance Capital, his understanding of the fund's operations, and his failure to detect the scheme within them. He had acknowledged that failure directly without mitigation. When Greer's cross-examination tried to suggest that Elliot's ignorance constituted willful blindness, that he had benefited from Marcus's machinations and had chosen not to look, Elliot had answered with the precision Jane recognized, specific, factual, without anger. The testimony, the coverage said, was credible in the particular way of a man who had decided to tell the truth about an uncomfortable thing and was not dressing it in anything. She read the coverage twice. She thought of the corner booth of the grain bowl and the 20% tip and the 7 words on a torn paper menu. She thought of what it cost in the specific economy of a man like Elliot to stand in a federal courtroom and say clearly, "I should have known. I didn't look. I was wrong." She thought it had cost him considerably and that he had paid it without complaint. She called him that evening. He answered on the second ring. "How do you feel?" she asked. A pause. "Like I said the right thing." "You did. It doesn't feel as clean as I expected." "It won't. That's not how it works." She sat in her apartment in the September dark. "The clean part comes later. Right now it just feels like what it is." "What is it?" "The truth," she said, "which is always heavier than the alternative and always worth it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you know so much about this?" "My mother kept a hard drive in a shoebox for 25 years, she said. "That's what the alternative costs." He was quiet for another moment. When he spoke again, his voice had the unguarded quality she had learned over many months to recognize as his most honest register. "I'm glad you found me," he said. "You found me," she said, "in a corner booth at 7:55 on a Tuesday." "That's true," he said, "but you decided to stay." She sat with that for a moment. Outside her window, New York was doing what it always did, indifferent and perpetual, holding no brief for anyone's interior landscape. "Yes," she said, "I did." She testified on a Wednesday. She had not slept much the night before. Not from fear, but from the productive insomnia of someone whose mind was reviewing things they had already reviewed, completely looking for variables they had already accounted for. At 2 a.m., she made tea and sat with it and went through the sequence one final time and found nothing new. By 3 a.m., she was asleep. She arrived at the courthouse at 8:15 in the Phase 4 Blazer, the structured black one, the courtroom one, the one she had bought specifically for this. Helen met her in the corridor. They had a brief exchange, the kind that experienced legal teams have before testimony. Not preparation, which was complete, but calibration. A check of the emotional register. "How are you?" Helen asked. "Ready," Jane said. "Good. That's what I need." She was called at 10:15. She walked to the stand in a room that was larger than she'd expected and smaller than it had looked on television, with a gallery that included reporters. And she noted in her peripheral vision, without looking directly, Elliot in the third row and Carol in the row behind him. She sat. She was sworn. She looked at the prosecutor, a young assistant U.S. attorney named Walsh, who was efficient and well-prepared, and she answered every question precisely and directly. The sequence of facts was one she knew as well as her own name: the restaurant, the internship, her mother's disclosure, the drive, the analysis, the legal research, the referral to Helen Park. She gave it without drama and without embellishment. Cross-examination was Greer's domain, and he was good. He was very good. He worked the personal relationship angle with the patience of a man who knew it was the best tool he had. He suggested carefully that a woman in love with a powerful man might be motivated to construct a case that served his interests. He suggested that her legal analysis had been shaped by the conclusion she wanted to reach rather than the evidence. He suggested that her mother's account delivered to her daughter, who then delivered it to her mother's former employer, had passed through 2 highly interested parties before it reached legal authorities. She answered each suggestion with the same quality she had brought to the Holloway situation 18 months ago in Marlowe's in front of a man she hadn't known was watching. Not aggressive, not flustered, steady. "My analysis is in this record," she said when he challenged its independence. "Every document I reviewed is identified. Every conclusion is sourced to specific evidence, and the legal theory has been independently assessed by federal prosecutors who have no relationship with Elliot Vance or with me. If my analysis is wrong, the record will show where and how. I'd encourage you to point to a specific error. Greer did not point to a specific error. He moved on. When he raised her mother, the delay, the silence, the accumulated years she answered from the same place she had always answered from the plain truth of it. My mother was 26 years old, she said. She found evidence of a sophisticated fraud. She went to the person she believed was responsible and was told she had misunderstood what she was looking at and that going further would destroy her professionally. She had no resources, no employer backing, no legal counsel. She made the decision that a frightened young woman with limited options makes when she's been told the machinery of power will be used against her if she speaks. She kept the evidence because she could not bring herself to destroy it. She kept it for 25 years in a shoebox on a closet shelf, and when her daughter was a lawyer, she gave it to her. She held Greer's gaze. That's the story. If there's a version of it that benefits from distortion, I'm not able to see it. There was a quality in the room after she said that, a particular stillness. She was aware of it without performing for it. Greer concluded his cross. The redirect was brief. She stepped down. She walked out of the stand and back to the gallery corridor, and in the hallway outside, she stood against the wall for exactly 5 seconds. Then she went to find her mother. Carol was in the hallway, standing with Helen's junior associate. She looked different, was the only word Jane had for it. Something had released in her face, some long-held particular tension in the area around her eyes and jaw, the region of the face that carries what the mind holds longest. She looked like a woman who had said the true thing in the right room to the people with the authority to act on it, and who was, for the first time in 25 years, simply standing afterward. Jane walked toward her and Carol opened her arms, and they stood together in the federal courthouse corridor, and Jane let herself be held by her mother the way she hadn't since she was small, without the adult composure that she usually carried, without the forward motion, just this. You were extraordinary, Carol said into her hair. So were you. The jury believed it. I watched their faces. I know. Jane. Carol pulled back and held her at arm's length and looked at her with that look, the complete one. You did this. You picked it up, and you carried it, and you brought it all the way here. I need you to know that. You kept the drive for 25 years, Jane said. I just found where to take it. That's not nothing. That's everything. They looked at each other for a moment in the corridor of a federal courthouse in September in New York, in the specific and ordinary miracle of two people who belong to each other and have come through something hard and are standing on the other side of it. She found Elliot outside on the courthouse steps in the first real autumn air of the year, that particular September quality, when the city finally exhales the summer heat and becomes itself again. He turned when he heard her. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since a corner booth, since 7 words on a torn paper menu, since a lobby in which everything had rearranged itself steadily, completely, with the specific attention of someone who had found the thing they intended to look at and saw no reason to look away. You were very good in there, he said. I had everything I needed. Yes, you did. A pause. How does it feel? She looked at the steps, at the street below, at the city going about its afternoon in the bright September light taxis and delivery trucks, and the particular texture of New York in motion, which was the only texture she'd ever fully trusted. Like something is finished, she said, and something else is starting. He came down the last step and stood beside her on the sidewalk in the ordinary light, in the ordinary noise, 2 people among 8 million, and he said quietly, That's a good way for something to feel. She turned to look at him. He looked back. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, I want to go to a restaurant that is not the Italian place. He smiled, the real one, the one that used more of his face, the one she had been cataloging without admitting it since December. There's a place in the West Village, he said. Good bread. Carol recommended it, actually. She has opinions. She has extremely specific opinions. It's a quality I recognize in her family. Jane looked at him for a moment longer than she needed to. Let's go, she said. They walked down the courthouse steps into the September afternoon and turned toward the city. And the city received them the way it received everyone, without ceremony, without judgment, moving at its perpetual speed around their particular stillness. The verdict came on a Friday in October. Guilty. On all counts. Jane was at her desk when Helen's text arrived, 2 words, nothing else. She read it and set her phone face down on her desk and looked at the window and the city beyond it, and let herself feel the full weight of the thing, which was not the same as the sharp emotion of the trial or the immediate sensation of the courthouse steps. It was quieter than that. The weight of a thing that has been wrong for a long time and has finally been corrected, which is not joy exactly, but is close to it the specific emotion of a righting. She called Carol first. Carol answered before the first ring had finished. She had been watching the news coverage. "Guilty," Carol said. And then nothing for a moment. Just that word in the air between them. "Guilty," Jane confirmed. Another silence. "I'm going to cry," Carol said. "I'm going to be very undignified about this. And I don't want you to say anything comforting because I don't need it." "Okay, I need to cry, and then I'm going to be fine." "Okay, Mom." She stayed on the phone. She could hear her mother breathing, and then the sound of someone letting go of a weight they have been holding so long they had forgotten the shape of their own arms without it. She didn't say anything comforting. She just stayed on the line. After a while, Carol said in a voice that was completely steady, "I want to go out to dinner. Tonight. All of us. All of us. Yumi, Elliot, Diana, all of us. I want to eat something good and drink something good and be with the people who did this thing together. I'll call Elliot. Tell him to pick somewhere with good bread." A pause. "And tell him thank you, from me directly. Tell him yourself tonight." Carol made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath. "I will," she said. "I absolutely will."
Up.
Sentencing was in January. Marcus Hale received 14 years on the federal wire fraud and securities fraud counts. The obstruction count added 2 years, which would run concurrently. He would be eligible for parole in 10, which Helen had told them was the realistic outcome given the sentencing guidelines. But the conviction itself, the full formal public accounting of what he had done, and over what period was the thing that mattered beyond the years. The court also ordered full restitution to affected investors to be calculated through a forensic accounting process that Elliot's team would coordinate. The process would take over a year. The amounts were large. Elliot had already before sentencing committed Vance capital to making affected investors whole, regardless of the restitution order timeline. That announcement had run in the financial press in November, and had done more for the firm's standing than anything else could have. Carol's name appeared in the sentencing documents as a victim of the obstruction count. It appeared in the public record now, Carol Calloway, former Vance Capital accountant who had identified and documented fraud in 1998 and 1999, and had been silenced and forced out for it. The public record held her account precisely for anyone who wanted to read it. She had asked quietly whether she would be able to see the document before it was finalized. Helen had arranged it. Carol read it at the kitchen table in the West Village studio. Her kitchen table now because she had decided to stay. She had the studio for as long as she wanted it. Elliot had made this clear in December without being asked, without drama. She had accepted it without making it mean more than it was, which was a practical solution offered by a man who was trying to do the right thing with what he had available. She read the document. She set it down. She looked at Jane, who was sitting across from her. "It says my name," Carol said. "Yes." "It says what he did." "Yes." Carol pressed her hands flat on the table. Her face was entirely still. Then she said very quietly, "Good." 8 months later, June. In New York was early summer in full expression. The heat not yet unbearable, the parks full, the particular quality of light that turned the city golden at evening in a way that made even veteran New Yorkers occasionally stop and look. Jane graduated from Harvard Law School on a Saturday morning. She had completed the final requirements of her degree in the evenings over the preceding months, a thesis requirement and one remaining seminar while working full-time at Vance Media, because that was the pace at which she had always operated and she saw no reason to change it. The ceremony was in Cambridge. She stood in the appropriate robes in the appropriate row with people she had studied alongside for 3 years, some of whom were going to large firms, some to clerkships, some to public interest work, a few to career pivots she suspected they'd been planning since first year but hadn't admitted. She accepted her diploma from the dean with both hands and looked at it for one moment and then moved out of the way for the next person because that was the correct thing to do. Her mother was in the audience. Carol had taken the Amtrak from New York the night before and was staying at the hotel near campus where Jane had reserved her a room. She was feeling well. The biologic therapy had stabilized the condition significantly. The most recent specialist report had used the word remission with appropriate caveats that Carol and Jane had both noted, and neither had allowed themselves to overinterpret. Diana was there too, which Jane had not expected. She appeared at the post-ceremony reception with 2 glasses of champagne and gave one to Jane and said without preamble, "Harriet says you handled the Meridian case last month as well as any third-year associate she's seen. That's not a compliment she gives." "I know," Jane said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." Diana raised her glass. "To the girl in the corner booth." Jane raised hers. "To the woman in the corner office." Diana's expression did the thing that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Exactly right," she said. Elliot arrived in the afternoon after the ceremony when the crowd had thinned and the day had settled into its quieter register. He had not come to the ceremony itself, she had not asked him to, and he had known without being told that the ceremony was hers and Carol's, and did not require his presence to be complete. He came to the garden behind the reception building where Jane and Carol were sitting at a small table with the last of the champagne and the particular quiet of an afternoon that had done what it needed to do. He greeted Carol first, which was the right order, and Carol said something to him in a low voice that Jane couldn't hear. He looked at Carol for a moment and then nodded once, the specific nod of a man accepting something he has needed to be given, and Carol patted his hand and picked up her champagne. He sat down across from Jane. She was still in the robe which she hadn't changed out of because she had nowhere to be for the rest of the day, and it seemed on reflection appropriate to stay in it a little longer. Her hair was down. The afternoon light came across the garden at a long angle. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put something on the table. She looked at it. A small envelope sealed her name written on it in the small, precise handwriting she recognized from a torn paper menu in a bistro on 54th Street. She picked it up. She opened it. Inside a folded piece of paper, she unfolded it. It was the original note. The one from Marlowe's torn from the paper menu, the ink slightly faded. 7 words in his handwriting. "You didn't flinch. That's rare." And below the original, in fresh ink added recently, she could tell from the slight difference in the pen. "Neither did you. Ever." She read it twice. Up at him. He was watching her with the same quality he had always brought to watching her. The full attention, the steadiness, the absolute absence of performance. The man from the corner booth unchanged in all the ways that mattered. "I kept it," he said. "From the day you gave the money back. I thought you might want it eventually." She looked at the note in her hand, at the 7 words she had first read standing at the service station in Marlowe's, not knowing anything, at the 4 words he had added which were not, she understood. A conclusion. They were a beginning, the way the best things were always a beginning. She folded it carefully. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in the pocket of her blazer, which she would be wearing under the robe where it would stay. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." Her mother refilled the champagne without being asked. The afternoon light went long and warm across the Cambridge garden, and the city they all lived in was waiting as it always was, without particular judgment. Jane picked up her glass. "Let's go home," she said. And they did. The end. The girl who served him coffee. Copyright, all rights reserved. Story Notes. Part 5. Author's note: extended epilogue material follows for audio pacing. 6 months after the verdict, Vance Capital published its first ever independent investor transparency report, a detailed accounting of fund structures, fee, disbursements, and operating costs going back 20 years, prepared by the Philadelphia forensic accounting firm that had conducted the internal audit. It was the kind of document that no private equity firm had ever voluntarily produced, and it generated significant attention in the financial press. The report was Helen Park's recommendation. Elliot had approved it without asking for modifications. Diana told Jane about it the morning it was released in the coffee room on the 33rd floor of Vance Tower, which was where they had their most direct conversations. "He didn't have to do that," Diana said. "He thought he did," Jane said. "That's a distinction that matters." "I know." Diana poured her coffee. "You're good for him. He's good for himself. I'm just present for it." Diana looked at her with the assessing quality Jane had come to recognize as her version of admiration, which was not a quality Diana distributed carelessly. "That's the right way to think about it," she said, "for both of you." Carol left the West Village studio in August on her own terms. She had found an apartment in Brooklyn Carroll Gardens, which Jane had observed was a coincidence that seemed slightly too apt in a building with a garden and a landlord who was responsive and a neighborhood that reminded her, she said, of what Queens had been when she was young. She had furniture delivered. She had a window box of herbs on the kitchen sill within the first week. She had, via a contact she'd located through a former colleague, begun consulting work in forensic accounting for a small firm that did civil litigation support. She told Jane about the consulting work over the phone, and Jane said, "You didn't tell me you were looking. I wanted to have something to report." "Mom, it's part-time. The health implications are fine. I've cleared it with the specialist. It's light work, and it's work I know how to do, and I've been not working for 16 years, and I'd like to be working again." A pause. "Is that all right with you?" Jane sat in her office at Vance Media and looked out at the city and felt the specific, complicated love of a daughter who has spent years protecting her mother and is now being asked to simply let her mother be a person. "It's perfect," she said. "Tell me about the firm," Carol told her. She was already good at it. She had always been good at it, and the 25 years had not changed that. And the people she was working with had done their due diligence and knew who she was and what she had done and had hired her anyway. Or perhaps because of it. Because a forensic accountant who had once unwound a 24-year fraud scheme from a shoebox in Queens was not a credential that needed much elaboration.
That's it.
On a Tuesday in October a year, and some months after the first Tuesday, that had changed the shape of everything, Jane arrived at a restaurant on the west side that she had not been to before. Elliot had picked it. She had told him it was his turn to pick without specifying criteria. It was a corner place smaller than the Italian restaurant with good light and a menu that changed with the season and a corner table that was not precisely like the corner booth at Marlowe's but occupied the same spatial logic in the room set apart with a good view of the door. She sat across from him. She looked at the menu. She looked at him. "Tell me something I don't know," she said. He considered. "I've been thinking about Sophie coming back to New York." "Your daughter?" "She's been in Edinburgh for 2 years. She's finishing her postgraduate work in the spring. She mentioned New York." He looked at Jane with an expression that was careful and open at once. "I thought you might want to know." She understood what he was saying, which was not just that his daughter was moving back, but that he wanted her to meet her. That he was extending something, not casually, not without the full weight of what it meant. She looked at the table, at the candle, at the city visible through the window, black and lit, going about its perpetual business. "I'd like that," she said. He nodded once, looked at his menu. She picked up hers. They ordered dinner. They talked about their weeks, his and hers, the ordinary and extraordinary material of 2 lives being lived in the same city at the same speed toward a future neither of them had mapped in advance, and both of them were, for possibly the first time in their respective lives, content to discover as it arrived. The restaurant was warm and the food was good, and the city moved outside the window in its ceaseless way, and none of it was extraordinary, except that it had always been this 2 people in a room paying full attention to each other without performance or pretense, or the particular weight of things unsaid. She had worked for that. They both had. It was, she thought, exactly what she'd earned.